In 1893, an American expedition digging through the ruins of Nippur pulled a clay tablet from the earth that would force every subsequent translator to confront an impossible problem. The text was clear. Sumerian cuneiform, baked hard in antiquity, preserved in readable condition. It described cities founded before a catastrophic flood. It listed their names, their rulers, the length of their reigns. Standard mythology, the kind found across a dozen similar tablets, except for one detail that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature and corresponds to no known location in the ancient Near East. Specific geographic markers that place these antediluvian settlements somewhere far beyond the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, in a climate the text describes as the land of perpetual ice that once knew warmth. The tablet is catalogue number CBS 10673. It sits now in Philadelphia, in a climate-controlled vault, examined occasionally by specialists who carefully avoid discussing what that phrase might mean. Before we go further, pause for just a moment and tell us in the comments where you're watching this from, what time it is where you are. This investigation works better when you know you're not alone in asking these questions. Thousands of others right now across dozens of countries and time zones are following the same evidence trail. You're part of something larger. Now, let's see where it leads. The problem with CBS 10673 isn't what it says about the flood. Every ancient culture has flood stories. Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, dozens of others. The problem is what it says about the world before the flood. Because if you map the geographic details literally, if you take the distance measurements and directional markers at face value, rather than dismissing them as mythological invention, the coordinates don't point to Mesopotamia. They don't point to the Mediterranean. They point, with disturbing consistency, to a landmass that in the text's own time frame shouldn't be accessible, shouldn't be habitable, shouldn't, according to everything we know about human history, contain cities at all. They point to Antarctica, not the Antarctica we know, not the white void of ice, 2 miles thick, the sterile continent where nothing human could survive for more than hours without technology. A different Antarctica, one that appears in fragments of evidence scattered across multiple disciplines. Geology, cartography, climatology, each field unaware of what the others have found, none of them in conversation with the Sumerian texts. Until you place them side by side. Until you ask the question nobody wants to ask, what if the tablets aren't mythology? What if they're records? This is not a simple story. It requires patience, a willingness to follow evidence that leads into uncomfortable territory. The academic consensus will tell you it's impossible, and the academic consensus has excellent reasons backed by mountains of data. But the consensus has never adequately explained CBS 10673's geographic annotations. It has never explained why Renaissance maps show Antarctic coastlines before the continent's official discovery. It has never explained what the Sumerians meant when they wrote that the Anunnaki, their term for the ruling class, the decision makers, those who came before, established settlements at the frozen edge of the world where the great waters meet the southern ice. We will examine 12 separate tablet collections tonight. We will look at excavation reports, museum catalogues, scholarly translations. We will consider geological evidence from ice cores drilled 2 miles down into Antarctic bedrock. We will analyze maps drawn 500 years ago that show details not confirmed until the 1950s. And we will do this slowly, methodically, the way careful investigation demands. Not to prove anything, not to force conclusions, but to see what the evidence suggests when you stop dismissing it, simply because it contradicts the approved timeline. The investigation begins with a city that shouldn't exist, mentioned in texts that predate the earliest known human settlements by periods measured not in centuries, but in epochs. A city the Sumerians called the first, Eridu, the place where, in their own words, kingship descended from heaven, where the Anunnaki first gathered, where the world, as they understood it, began. But Eridu, the ruins we've excavated in southern Iraq, might not be the original Eridu. It might be something else. A memorial, a reconstruction, a namesake settlement built in remembrance of something older, something lost beneath waters that rose when the ice somewhere far away began to melt. The clay tablet sits in Philadelphia, silent and patient as it has for more than a century, waiting for someone to take its geographic claims seriously, waiting for someone to plot the coordinates it contains and follow them south, past the known world, past the navigable seas, into the frozen emptiness where, according to every textbook, nothing human has ever existed. The waiting may finally be over. Let's begin where the Sumerians began, with the first city, the oldest memory, the place before the flood changed everything. The first cities, before the deluge, the Sumerian king. This distinction matters. It exists as a physical object, multiple physical objects, in fact, catalogued in museums across the world. The most complete version sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a clay prism inscribed with dense columns of cuneiform. Its catalogue designation is WB444, also known as the Weld-Blundell prism, named for the collector who acquired it in the early 20th century. It was created around 2000 BCE, but it records information the scribes claimed was far older, passed down through generations, copied and recopied from earlier tablets now lost. The document lists a succession of cities. For each city, it names the rulers, the length of their reigns, and when kingship moved from one city to another. It is, by any measure, an administrative record, the kind of thing governments create to track lineage, to establish legitimacy, to maintain continuity across time, except for one section that strains credibility so severely that most scholars classify it as mythological preamble, a legendary prehistory invented to add weight to later historical claims. The section describes 8 kings who ruled before the flood, antediluvian rulers governing 5 different cities: Eridu, Batibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shuruppak. The problem isn't that these rulers existed before a great flood. Flood narratives are common across cultures. The problem is how long the text claims they ruled. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is given a reign of 28,800 years. His successor, Alelgar, ruled 36,000 years. The numbers continue in this pattern through all 8 kings, totaling 200 years of antediluvian civilization. Standard interpretation, obvious exaggeration, mythological time, not meant to be taken literally. The numbers are symbolic, representing great antiquity, a golden age before catastrophe struck. Reasonable interpretation, supported by the fact that human beings don't live for 30,000 years. But it creates a secondary problem that interpretation doesn't address. Why maintain such precise bureaucratic structure for mythological content? Why list each city, each ruler, in careful administrative sequence if the entire exercise is metaphorical? Why preserve this section at all, copying it faithfully across multiple versions of the king list, treating it with the same documentary care as the later historical sections that match archaeological evidence? One possibility, rarely considered: the numbers are accurate, but the unit of measurement is wrong. Not years as we understand them, months perhaps, seasons, lunar cycles. If you divide 28,800 by 12, Alulim's reign becomes 2,400 years. Still impossibly long for a human lifespan, but not impossibly long for a dynasty, a ruling lineage, a succession of leaders bearing the same title. If the text records not individual rulers but ruling periods, royal houses that maintained power across centuries, the numbers move from mythological to merely ancient. But this still doesn't explain the geographic problem, because when you examine the full text of the king list alongside other tablets that reference these same antediluvian cities, you find descriptions of their locations that don't match the landscape of southern Mesopotamia. Not approximately, not in ways that could result from geographic shifts over millennia. They don't match at all. Bad, Tibira, the second city to hold kingship, is described in supplementary texts as lying at the place where the sun reflects off endless white plains. Larak is positioned where the ground sleeps, frozen through the year. These are not descriptions of Mesopotamia in any historical period, not under any known climate conditions. The region has been hot and arid for the entire span of human civilization. Even during ice ages, when Europe froze, southern Iraq remained temperate. There is no period in human history when these descriptions would apply to the territory between the Tigris and Euphrates. Unless the cities weren't in Mesopotamia, unless the Sumerian civilization we excavated in Iraq was not the first iteration, but a later reconstruction, a renewed culture carrying memories of earlier settlements in a different location entirely. Unless the flood the texts describe, the event that ended the antediluvian period, was not a local Mesopotamian flood, but something far larger, a global catastrophe that forced survivors to migrate, to rebuild, to carry with them the names and organizational structures of cities that no longer existed, cities now inaccessible, buried not under sand but under ice. This interpretation requires accepting several propositions, each individually unlikely, that Sumerian civilization predates current estimates by significant margins, that humans established complex urban settlements in climatic conditions unlike any known from the historical period, that geographic knowledge was preserved across catastrophic cultural disruption with sufficient accuracy to encode real locations in later texts. Stack these propositions together, and the whole structure becomes too speculative for academic consensus. Easier to dismiss the entire question, to categorize the antediluvian section as mythology and move on to more tractable evidence. But the evidence doesn't move on, it accumulates. Because the Sumerian king list is not the only tablet with this problem. The Eridu Genesis, the name scholars gave to a fragmentary creation narrative discovered at Nippur, exists in several damaged copies, the most substantial being CBS 1063 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The tablet dates to approximately 1000 N6EE, Old Babylonian period, though the story it tells is demonstrably older, Sumerian in origin, copied from earlier sources. It describes the creation of humans, the founding of the first 5 cities, the same 5 listed in the king list, and the flood that destroyed them. Standard creation mythology, except for the details. The text specifies that the first city, Eridu, was founded where the sweet waters meet the salt. This phrase appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature in reference to the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates empty into the sea. Conventional interpretation places mythological Eridu at this geographic location, and indeed archaeologists have excavated a city called Eridu in southern Iraq that matches many details from the texts. The city was real. It was inhabited from approximately 5000 BCE onward. It contained temples dedicated to Enki, the god the texts associate with Eridu. Clean archaeological validation of the textual tradition, except the excavated Eridu doesn't match the full description. The text described the original Eridu as having been established at the edge of ice, where great mountains meet the sea, where the Abzu lies beneath the land. Southern Iraq has no mountains. It is fundamentally flat, alluvial plain stretching for hundreds of miles. The Abzu, the underground freshwater realm Enki was said to rule, appears in text as a physical location, a place with depth, with vertical extent, with chambers and passages. No such geological feature exists beneath the Iraqi site. Ground-penetrating surveys show only saturated sediment, the expected result of millennia of flooding and silt deposition. So either the texts are purely mythological, invented imagery with no geographic referent, or they describe 2 different places, the original Eridu, whose location the texts preserve, and the later Iraqi settlement built in its memory and bearing its name. This happens. Colonists name new settlements after old homelands. New York, New England, Nova Scotia, carrying memory forward in nomenclature. If Sumerian civilization originated elsewhere, if catastrophe forced migration to Mesopotamia, the survivors would naturally name their new foundations after the lost cities, attempting to rebuild what was destroyed to maintain continuity with the past. The academic objection to this scenario is fundamental. There is no archaeological evidence for pre-Mesopotamian Sumerian civilization anywhere else on Earth. No cities, no tablets, no artifacts predating the Iraqi settlements have been found in any other location. The absence of evidence in archaeology generally constitutes evidence of absence. If the earlier civilization existed, where is it? Where are the ruins? One answer, uncomfortable but consistent with the textual evidence, beneath 2 miles of Antarctic ice, utterly inaccessible to archaeological investigation, preserved in frozen suspension since the climate catastrophe the texts record as the flood. Antarctica was not always frozen. This is not speculation. It is established geological fact, confirmed by decades of ice core research, fossil discoveries, and climatological modeling. During the Eocene epoch, approximately 56 to 34 million years ago, Antarctica supported temperate forests. The continent was ice-free, positioned over the South Pole, but warm enough to sustain vegetation, rivers, complex ecosystems. This is not controversial. Fossils of ferns, trees, and land animals have been recovered from exposed rock formations along Antarctica's coast. The continent was habitable for millions of years. The glaciation began approximately 34 million years ago during the Eocene-Oligocene transition. The climate shifted rapidly in geological terms. Within several 100,000 years, Antarctica went from temperate to frozen. Ice sheets spreading from the interior toward the coasts until the entire continent was locked under ice. This transition is well documented in marine sediment cores, ice cores drilled through the Antarctic ice sheet itself, and isotope analysis from fossils worldwide. The scientific consensus is absolute. Antarctica was habitable, then became uninhabitable, and has remained frozen for 34 million years, which creates an obvious chronological problem for any theory connecting Sumerian tablets to Antarctic settlements. The Sumerian texts date to roughly 2000 BCE 4000 years ago. The Antarctic ice dates to 34 million years ago. The gap is not centuries. It is not millennia. It is 34 million years, a span so vast that no continuous human memory, no oral tradition, no preserved knowledge could possibly bridge it. The timescales don't match. The evidence, however carefully accumulated, cannot connect across such temporal distance, unless the ice wasn't always there. Not in recent history. Not during the period when humans were capable of building cities and recording their locations in written language. The geological consensus holds that Antarctica has been continuously frozen for the entire span of the current ice age, which began 6 million years ago. But ice ages are not uniform. They consist of glacial and interglacial periods, cycles of expansion and retreat, cold phases alternating with warmer intervals. During interglacial periods, ice sheets retreat from their maximum extent. Sea levels rise, coastlines shift, and in some models, controversial models, challenged by mainstream glaciology, but not conclusively disproven, certain regions of Antarctica, particularly West Antarctica and coastal areas, could have experienced temporary ice-free conditions during warm interglacial phases as recently as 15,000 years ago. The evidence for this possibility comes primarily from ice core analysis conducted by teams drilling deep into the Antarctic ice sheet. In 2017, researchers announced they had extracted ice cores dating to 7 million years ago from the Allan Hills region. These cores contained unexpected findings. Layers within the ice showed evidence of melting and refreezing, suggesting that even during the broader ice age, temporary warming events caused partial melting of the ice sheet. More recently, in 2004, studies of West Antarctic ice cores revealed that portions of the ice sheet may have collapsed entirely during interglacial periods, exposing bedrock and coastal areas to open air for periods lasting thousands of years before reglaciation occurred. These findings are contentious. The majority of glaciologists maintain that while ice sheets fluctuate, complete melting of significant Antarctic regions during recent interglacials is unlikely, but unlikely is not impossible. And recent, in geological terms, can mean 15,000 years ago, a time frame that brings the possibility of habitable Antarctic coastlines into the same broad epoch as early human civilization, if not into direct chronological contact with Sumerian culture. What if the Sumerian tablets don't record their own contemporary world? What if they preserve much older information, passed down through oral tradition, copied from sources that predated writing, maintained across thousands of years because the knowledge was considered essential? Cultures do this. Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions describing the coastline of Australia before sea level rise flooded what is now the continental shelf events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. Yet the stories preserve accurate geographic information verified by modern bathymetric mapping. If one culture can maintain geographic memory for 10,000 years, why not others? The Sumerian tablets repeatedly claim to record information from before the flood, from the time when the Anunnaki descended and kingship was lowered from heaven. If these phrases represent not divine intervention, but cultural memory of an earlier civilization, one that existed during a climatically different period, then the texts might be attempting to preserve knowledge of settlements that were real, were inhabited, and were abandoned when climate conditions changed catastrophically. When the ice returned, when the cities became inaccessible, the flood narratives aren't about rain. Read them carefully. The Atrahasis tablets in the British Museum catalogue numbers BM 78941 and BM 78943, Old Babylonian period, extensively translated, describe the flood as lasting 7 days and 7 nights, with water rising from both above and below. But the emphasis is not on precipitation. The emphasis is on the sudden, catastrophic rise of sea level, on waters breaking forth from the deep, on the world being returned to the condition before creation. This language is consistent with glacial melt events, with the rapid collapse of ice sheets releasing vast quantities of water into the oceans, raising global sea levels by hundreds of feet in geologically brief periods. Such events occurred at the end of the last glacial maximum, approximately 12,000 years ago. They are recorded in sediment layers worldwide. The evidence is not disputed. What remains disputed is whether humans were present, whether they built settlements in the regions affected, whether they recorded what happened. The Sumerian tablets suggest they were present. They did build, and they did record. Not in Mesopotamia, not initially. Mesopotamia was where they fled, where they rebuilt, where they continued their culture in a new location after the old one became uninhabitable. The original settlements, the antediluvian cities, remain where the texts place them, at the frozen edge of the world, beneath the ice that returned and has not yet released what it covers. This interpretation is not provable, but it is testable. If the tablets contain genuine geographic information about pre-flood settlements, that information should be internally consistent. Distances should match, directional markers should align, and most critically, if you plot the coordinates the texts provide, they should point somewhere specific, somewhere coherent, not scatter randomly across impossible locations. They should point to a place. They do point to a place, and that place presents an entirely different category of problem. When Antarctica was green, the ice is 2 miles thick in East Antarctica. Beneath it lies bedrock that has not seen sunlight for tens of millions of years, locked in frozen darkness, preserved in conditions more sterile than any human cleanroom. We know the ice is 2 miles thick because we have measured it. Ice penetrating radar, seismic surveys, gravitational analysis. The measurements are precise. The Antarctic ice sheet contains approximately 5 million cubic kilometers of ice, comprising about 90% of all the ice on Earth. If it melted entirely, global sea levels would rise roughly 60 meters. This would redraw every coastline, submerge every coastal city, fundamentally alter the geography of human civilization. The ice has not always been there. This is not controversial. It is not speculation. It is mainstream geological consensus based on multiple independent lines of evidence. 50 million years ago, Antarctica was not frozen. It was temperate. It supported forests, fossil remains of Nothofagus, southern beech, podocarp pines and ferns have been recovered from exposed mountain ranges where erosion has stripped away the ice. These fossils are not anomaly. They are abundant enough to reconstruct entire ecosystems, to understand what types of vegetation grew, what climate conditions would have supported them, what seasonal patterns would have prevailed. Antarctica during the Eocene epoch was similar to modern Patagonia or New Zealand. Cool, temperate, forested, with rivers draining from interior mountains to coastal plains, emptying into seas that were warmer than the freezing waters surrounding the continent today. The transition from green to white occurred during the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, approximately 34 million years ago. The causes are well understood. Continental drift had positioned Antarctica over the South Pole. Ocean currents shifted as South America separated from the Antarctic Peninsula and the circumpolar current formed, thermally isolating the continent. Without warm water from the tropics reaching Antarctic shores, temperatures dropped. Snow accumulated. Ice sheets formed in the highlands and began spreading outward. Within several 100,000 years, rapid in geological terms, but still an immense span from a human perspective, Antarctica was completely glaciated. The ice has remained, with fluctuations, for 34 million years. During this period, humans evolved, spread across the earth, developed language, created civilization. The entire story of humanity, from Australopithecines to astronauts, occurred while Antarctica was frozen. This timeline is not in doubt, but ice ages are not uniform. The current ice age, the Quaternary glaciation, began 6 million years ago, but it consists of cycles: glacial periods when ice sheets expand, and interglacial periods when they retreat. We are currently in an interglacial, the Holocene, which began approximately 11,700 years ago. During the previous glacial maximum, which peaked about 20,000 years ago, ice covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Canada was buried under ice sheets over 2 miles thick, just as Antarctica is today. Then the climate warmed. The ice melted. Within several thousand years, the North American and European ice sheets disappeared almost entirely. Sea levels rose by 100,000 meters. The coastlines we know today were established. This happened recently enough that humans witnessed it, recorded it in oral traditions, and in some cases adjusted their settlements in response. If ice sheets can disappear from North America and Europe in a few thousand years, why assume Antarctic ice is permanent? Why assume it has remained constant for the entire Quaternary period? The assumption is based on Antarctica's geographic isolation, its position over the pole, the stabilizing effect of the circumpolar current. These factors make Antarctic ice more resistant to melting than Northern Hemisphere ice sheets. But more resistant does not mean invulnerable, and evidence is accumulating that suggests during certain interglacial periods, portions of the Antarctic ice sheet have retreated significantly and in some regions disappeared entirely. In 2019, researchers from Princeton University published findings based on ice cores drilled in East Antarctica. The cores contained ice dating back 2 million years, providing a continuous climate record spanning multiple glacial cycles. Analysis of trapped air bubbles and isotope ratios revealed something unexpected. During some interglacial periods, particularly around 1 million years ago and again around 400,000 years ago, Antarctic temperatures spiked significantly higher than during the current interglacial. Carbon dioxide levels, preserved in the ice, showed concentrations similar to pre-industrial modern levels, suggesting a climate warm enough to support significantly reduced ice coverage. The researchers concluded that during these warm periods, portions of the West Antarctic ice sheet may have collapsed, raising global sea levels by several meters beyond what current interglacial conditions produce. More recent work, published in 2024, focused on West Antarctica specifically. Ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed subglacial topography showing ancient river valleys, lake beds, and sediment deposits inconsistent with continuous ice coverage. Analysis of sediment cores drilled through the ice sheet into the bedrock below showed layers containing pollen, organic material, and microscopic marine organisms dated to approximately 15,000 years ago, the end of the last glacial maximum when global ice was beginning to melt. The presence of these organisms suggests that portions of West Antarctica were not covered by ice during this period, that ocean water reached areas now buried under thousands of meters of ice, and that coastal regions were ice-free long enough for biological activity to establish and leave traces in the sediment record. This research is contested. Other glaciologists argue that the sediment deposits could have been transported by subglacial water flow rather than deposited during ice-free periods. The debate is ongoing, but the possibility exists, supported by physical evidence, that Antarctica has not been uniformly frozen throughout the recent past, that ice-free coastal regions existed during interglacial periods within the last 20,000 years, and that these regions could have been, at least temporarily, habitable. Habitable does not mean inhabited. Establishing that land was ice-free and climatically suitable for life is not the same as demonstrating that life, particularly human life, was present. The conventional archaeological timeline places the earliest human presence in the Americas at roughly 15,000 years ago, possibly older. Human expansion into Australia occurred at least 50,000 years ago, requiring ocean crossings and settlement of previously uninhabited land masses. Humans have demonstrated both the navigational capability and the will to colonize remote, challenging environments. But no archaeological evidence, no tools, no structures, no human remains has been found in Antarctica. Every expedition that has searched has returned empty-handed. The counter-argument is simple. We haven't looked beneath the ice. Archaeological surveys in Antarctica are conducted on exposed rock, less than 1% of the continent's surface. The remaining 99% is buried. If settlements existed during ice-free periods in regions now glaciated, they would be completely inaccessible, encased in ice, invisible to any detection method short of drilling through thousands of meters of ice sheet in the correct location. And without prior knowledge of where to drill, the probability of finding anything by random sampling is effectively zero, unless you have geographic coordinates preserved in written records, unless an earlier civilization, one with knowledge of the settlements, recorded their locations before catastrophe made them inaccessible, unless those records were preserved, copied, and passed down through successor cultures that no longer understood what they described, but maintained the information because it was considered sacred, foundational, essential to their identity. In that scenario, you wouldn't need to search randomly. You would know where to look. The Sumerian tablets contain geographic information. This is not disputed. City locations, distances between settlements, descriptions of terrain and climate, these details appear throughout the texts. What is disputed is whether the information is accurate, whether it describes real places, or whether it represents mythological geography, invented settings for legendary narratives. The default assumption, in the absence of corroborating evidence, is mythology. But what if the corroborating evidence exists, preserved in a different form, created by a different culture, unaware of the Sumerian tablets, but documenting the same underlying geographic reality? What if there are maps? Maps that shouldn't exist. The Piri-Reis map is not a mystery in the sense that we don't know what it is. We know exactly what it is. A world map compiled in 1530 by Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, drawn on gazelle skin, approximately 90 centimeters by 63 centimeters, showing the Atlantic Ocean, the western coast of Africa and Europe, the eastern coast of South and Central America, and a southern landmass extending along the bottom edge of the map. The map is housed in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. Its provenance is secure. The authenticity is not in question. What is in question is how Piri Reis knew what to draw. The map contains notations in Turkish explaining its sources. Piri Reis states that he compiled it from approximately 20 older maps, including charts used by Christopher Columbus and maps from the time of Alexander. The Columbus connection is plausible. Columbus died in 1506, and Ottoman naval intelligence could have obtained Spanish charts through captured vessels or espionage. But the claim that some source maps dated to Alexander the Great, over 1700 years earlier, is more difficult to accept. No maps from Alexander's era have survived. The oldest known world maps date to the medieval period. If ancient maps existed, where are they? Why would only Piri Reis have access to them? Why would no other cartographer reference these sources? The standard scholarly interpretation is that Piri Reis exaggerated his sources to enhance the map's prestige, that the Alexander reference is legendary rather than literal, and that the map's content derives entirely from contemporary or near-contemporary sources available to an Ottoman naval officer in the early 16th century. This interpretation is reasonable and consistent with how cartography typically works. Map makers compile information from explorers' reports, other maps, and their own observations, occasionally embellishing their credentials with claims of ancient knowledge to boost credibility. The problem is the southern landmass. Along the bottom of the Piri Reis map, extending westward from the tip of South America, is a coastline that does not match any known feature. It is too far south to be South America. The orientation is wrong. The scale doesn't fit. Early researchers assumed it represented the South American coast, distorted by cartographic error, a common occurrence in early Renaissance maps where longitude was difficult to calculate accurately. But in 1956, a U.S. Navy hydrographic engineer named Arlington Mallory examined the map closely and proposed something different. The southern coastline wasn't South America at all. It was Antarctica. Specifically, it was the coast of Queen Maud Land, the Atlantic-facing sector of Antarctica, depicted as it would appear if the ice sheet were absent and the underlying landmass were visible. Mallory's claim was extraordinary. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, 3 centuries after Piri Reis drew his map. Moreover, the coast of Queen Maud Land is not visible in its current state. It is buried beneath hundreds of meters of ice, extending out into the ocean as permanent ice shelves. The actual rocky coastline lies hidden beneath this ice. It was not mapped with any accuracy until the 1950s, when seismic surveys and ice-penetrating technologies allowed cartographers to determine where the land surface actually lay beneath the ice. If Piri Reis's map showed this coastline, he was depicting something that would have been impossible to observe in 1513, something that would not be officially known for another 400 years. The comparison Mallory presented was striking. When overlaid with modern seismic surveys of Queen Maud Land's subglacial topography, the Piri Reis coastline showed significant correlation. Bays, headlands, and coastal features aligned with the buried bedrock coastline, not with the modern ice-covered surface. The match was not perfect. Distortions were present, consistent with the kinds of errors expected in Renaissance cartography, but the overall pattern was too similar to dismiss as coincidence. The mainstream scholarly response was skepticism. Closer analysis suggested that what appeared to be Antarctic coastline might be an exaggerated and distorted rendering of the South American coast, pushed too far south and west by errors in latitude and longitude calculations. The apparent matches with Queen Maud Land's topography might be coincidental, or might result from confirmation bias. Humans are skilled at seeing patterns even in random data, and if you expect to find Antarctica, you will interpret ambiguous features as supporting that expectation. Without direct evidence that Piri Reis had access to maps showing Antarctica, the simpler explanation, cartographic cartographic error combined with imagination remained more plausible. But Piri Reis was not the only Renaissance cartographer to draw a southern continent with surprising detail. In 1531, French cartographer Orontius Phineas published a world map showing Terra Australis, the unknown southern land, as a massive continent centered on the South Pole. This was not unusual. Many mapmakers of the era included a hypothetical southern continent based on the ancient Greek theory that land masses in the north must be balanced by equivalent land masses in the south to maintain global equilibrium. What was unusual was the specificity with which Phineas depicted this continent. Rather than sketching a vague circular landmass, he drew a detailed coastline with rivers, mountain ranges, and interior features. The continent's shape, overall, resembles Antarctica. It is positioned correctly over the pole. The scale, while not exact, is approximately correct. And, most intriguingly, the coastline shows ice-free features, bays, inlets, river mouths that correspond, when compared to modern subglacial mapping, with the bedrock topography beneath Antarctica's ice sheet. Charles Hapgood, a professor of history at Keene State College in New Hampshire, spent much of the 1960s analysing these maps. His research, compiled in the book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, 1966, argued that the Piri Reis and Orontius Phineas maps, along with several others, contained geographic information that could only have been obtained by surveying Antarctica during an ice-free period. Hapgood proposed that an advanced ancient civilization predating known history had mapped the entire Earth, including Antarctica, at a time when the continent was not yet fully glaciated. These maps were then copied and recopied through successive cultures, degrading with each iteration until fragments reached medieval and Renaissance cartographers, who included them in their compilations without fully understanding what they represented. Hapgood's theory was speculative, and he knew it. He acknowledged the lack of direct evidence for his proposed ancient civilization, but he argued that the cartographic evidence demanded explanation, and the conventional explanations, coincidence, error, imagination, did not adequately account for the specific correlations between Renaissance maps and modern surveys of subglacial Antarctic topography. If the maps did not show Antarctica, what did they show? And if they did show Antarctica, how did the mapmakers know what to draw? The academic response to Hapgood was overwhelmingly negative. Cartographic historians pointed out that the supposed matches between Renaissance maps and Antarctic topography required selective interpretation, ignoring features that didn't match and emphasizing those that did. The scale and orientation of the depicted coastlines often required significant adjustment to fit modern data, and most critically, there were simpler explanations. The Renaissance maps showed imagined geography based on theoretical beliefs, and any resemblances to Antarctica were coincidental. Humans have been drawing maps for thousands of years. Over that span, by pure chance, some imagined coastlines will resemble real coastlines that were unknown at the time. This doesn't imply hidden knowledge. It implies probability. Hapgood's theory faded into the realm of fringe speculation, cited primarily by alternative historians seeking evidence for lost civilizations. Mainstream scholarship moved on, but the maps didn't go away. They remained physical objects preserved in museums and libraries, available for examination. And while Hapgood's broader theory of ancient Ice Age cartographers lacks supporting evidence, the specific question he raised has never been satisfactorily answered. Why do multiple Renaissance maps show a southern continent with detailed coastal features, some of which correlate with Antarctica's actual subglacial topography, 3 centuries before the continent's official discovery? One possibility, rarely explored in academic literature, is that the maps don't show ancient knowledge from millions of years ago, don't require an advanced Ice Age civilization with global surveying capability. They might show something more recent. If portions of Antarctica were ice-free during late interglacial periods, 15,000 years ago within the time frame of early human expansion, and if coastal civilizations existed in those ice-free regions, those civilizations would have created maps. Local maps showing coastlines, harbors, river mouths, resources. Not sophisticated global projections, but practical navigational charts. If those maps were preserved, copied and eventually transmitted through trade networks to Mediterranean cultures, fragments of that knowledge could have reached medieval Islamic and European cartographers who incorporated them into their own compilations without understanding the source. This scenario doesn't require lost super civilizations. It requires only that humans were present in Antarctica during a warmer period, that they mapped their local environment, and that knowledge transmission, always fragile, always partial, carried fragments of that information forward. The rest is cartographic archaeology. You find the pieces, you trace the lineage, you reconstruct what was known and when. But tracing cartographic lineage backward from Renaissance maps leads not to a single clear source, but to a diffuse network of claims about ancient maps, sources that no longer exist, references that cannot be verified. Piri Reis cited maps from Alexander's time. Orontius Phineus provided no source citation at all. Medieval Arab geographers occasionally referenced older Greek and Roman maps that have not survived. The trail goes cold. Either the sources never existed, were misattributed, or were lost in the centuries of manuscript destruction that accompanied the fall of ancient libraries. Alexandria, Constantinople, the contents of scriptoriums burned during the collapse of the Roman Empire, or the sources were never Greek or Roman at all. They were older, and they were recorded not in cartographic form but in text, in tablets inscribed with cuneiform, preserving geographic knowledge in linguistic rather than visual format. Knowledge that described where the cities were, how far apart, what landmarks surrounded them, what routes connected them. Knowledge compiled not from exploration in the cartographer's own time, but from memory, from records passed down, from tablets copied because the information was considered essential even after the places themselves became inaccessible. Knowledge like the geographic annotations in the Sumerian king list, like the location markers in the Eridu Genesis, like the descriptions scattered across dozens of tablets of the places where the Anunnaki gathered, where their assemblies met, where their authority was established before the flood made their cities unreachable. If you want to know where the Anunnaki cities were, you read the tablets, not for mythology, for coordinates. And the tablets are very specific about what those cities contained, what structures stood at their centers, what purposes those structures served. They describe in architectural detail buildings that should not exist. Meeting halls designed for gatherings that current models of ancient civilization cannot accommodate. Assemblies of a scale and sophistication that challenge every assumption about what was possible in prehistory. They describe halls large enough for hundreds to convene, chambers with acoustic properties suggesting advanced architectural knowledge. Locations selected for reasons that, when examined closely, suggest criteria we would expect not from ancient settlements, but from planned administrative centers, deliberate constructions positioned according to specific strategic or symbolic logic. The texts do not present these as mythological palaces in the sky. They present them as physical structures in specific cities, structures that could be visited, that required maintenance, that served functional purposes in governance and decision-making. Structures whose existence the texts never question, never mythologize, simply record as factual architectural features of the world before the flood. If the texts are literal, those structures existed. If they existed, they are somewhere. And if the geographic markers in the texts point where the evidence suggests they point, those assembly halls are buried beneath Antarctic ice, waiting in frozen darkness for someone to take the coordinates seriously enough to drill down and find them. That possibility changes everything. It changes what we should be looking for. And more pressingly, it changes how we should interpret the most enigmatic term in Sumerian literature, the word Anunnaki itself, and what it meant to the people who wrote it down as if it were the most natural, obvious thing in the world, the Anunnaki assembly halls. The word appears 237 times across cuneiform tablets spanning more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian literature. Anunnaki. In Sumerian, it is written Tai, transliterated as Da, Nun, Na, Ki, or sometimes Da, Nun, Na, with the I determinative indicating divine or elevated status. The conventional translation is those who from heaven to earth came, though this rendering is interpretive rather than literal. More precisely, it breaks down as An, heaven, sky, Unne, offspring seed, Ki, earth place, heaven seed, earth, the offspring of heaven upon earth, beings from above established on the ground. Who they were depends entirely on which scholarly framework you adopt. In mythological interpretation, the Anunnaki are gods, members of the Sumerian and Babylonian pantheon, deities responsible for various aspects of creation and governance. In this reading, they function as theological constructs, personifications of natural forces or abstract principles, characters in religious narratives meant to explain cosmic order and human origins. They are not historical figures. They are divine actors in symbolic stories. An alternative interpretation, popular in certain alternative historical circles, treats the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors, literal beings from the sky who came to Earth, created or genetically modified humans, and ruled as gods before departing or being overthrown. This interpretation takes the heaven seed Earth etymology at face value, assumes the Sumerians were describing actual events, and reads the texts as garbled records of alien contact. This framework is rejected by academic scholarship as lacking evidence, relying on selective reading of texts and importing modern science fiction concepts into ancient religious literature. But there is a third interpretation, less dramatic than alien intervention, but more concrete than pure mythology. The Anunnaki were a ruling class, a social elite, a group of decision-makers who held authority over early Sumerian civilization. In this reading, those from heaven to earth is not literal but honorific, a title conveying elevated status, much like highness or excellency in later cultures. The Anunnaki were human, but they were the leaders, the ones who established cities, who organized labor, who made laws, who maintained continuity across generations. They were, quite literally, the administration, and the assembly halls the texts describe were not mythical palaces, but actual meeting spaces where this ruling class convened to make collective decisions. This interpretation is not fringe. It is supported by textual evidence. In many tablets, the Anunnaki are described performing mundane administrative tasks, assigning land, settling disputes, overseeing construction projects. They are not distant, unreachable gods, but present, active participants in social organization. The texts treat them as accessible, as part of the world's functioning structure. They can be addressed, petitioned, held accountable. They are not omnipotent. They make mistakes, argue among themselves, form factions. They behave, in every textual respect, like a ruling council, a deliberative body responsible for governance. If this interpretation is correct, then the assembly halls the texts describe were real buildings, physical locations where this council met, and the texts provide descriptions of these halls with a level of architectural detail that suggests first-hand knowledge, the kind of specificity that comes from observation rather than invention. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, exists in multiple fragmentary copies, the most complete being a set of 7 tablets excavated from Nineveh and now held in the British Museum. One fragment, catalogued as K3473, comes from Tablet VI and describes the construction of Babylon's Esagila temple complex, built to honor Marduk after his victory over Tiamat. But embedded in this description is a reference to an earlier model, a prototype upon which Esagila was supposedly based. a hall that existed before Babylon, before the current age, built by the Anunnaki in their assembly. The hall is described as having 50 great doors, chambers arranged in concentric circles, with a central space large enough for the assembly of the great gods in their entirety. This is not symbolic language. 50 doors is a specific architectural feature, one that implies a structure of significant scale and complexity. Concentric arrangement suggests deliberate design for acoustic or symbolic purposes. The emphasis on size, large enough for the entire assembly, indicates that the building was designed to accommodate a substantial number of participants, not a handful of mythological deities, but a working council of meaningful size. Similar descriptions appear in earlier Sumerian tablets. The instructions of Shurupak, a wisdom text found among the Abu Salabic tablets excavated in the 1960s, references the Great Hall of the Anunnaki at Eridu, where decisions are made that govern the world. The text doesn't describe the hall in architectural detail, but it treats its existence as an established fact, something the audience would recognize without explanation. This suggests the hall was part of common cultural knowledge, a landmark so well known that merely mentioning it evoked a clear image. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in multiple copies including tablets BM 78941 and BM 78943 in the British Museum, describes events leading up to the flood. Before the catastrophe, the Anunnaki are depicted holding repeated assemblies to discuss the noise of mankind, which has become intolerable. These assemblies are convened in a specific location, referred to as the Ubshu Ukina, a term often translated as assembly hall or place of destinies. The text specifies that the Ubshu Ukina is located at Nippur in the version that survives, but earlier references suggest this may be an anachronistic attribution, a later redaction placing the hall in a city familiar to the Babylonian scribes who copied the text. The original location may have been different, lost when the earlier tablets were destroyed or became illegible. What did these halls actually look like? The texts emphasize size, symmetry, and acoustic properties. Multiple references describe the halls as places where words carry to every corner, suggesting design considerations for sound distribution. Concentric or radial arrangements appear repeatedly, which is architecturally significant. Radial layouts maximize sightlines and distribute participants around a central focal point, ideal for deliberative assemblies where all members need to see and hear the proceedings. 50 doors, if taken literally, implies multiple entry points, possibly for different groups or ranks entering through designated portals. This is not primitive architecture. This is sophisticated design reflecting complex organizational needs. Is there archaeological evidence for such buildings? In Mesopotamia, no. The largest excavated temple structures, the ziggurats, the palace complexes, do not match these descriptions. They are impressive, certainly, but they are not designed as deliberative chambers with radial symmetry and dozens of entrances. They are temples for ritual or palaces for royal administration, functionally different from the assembly halls described in the texts. Either the descriptions are exaggerated, mythologized elaborations of simpler structures, or the actual halls existed elsewhere in locations that have not been archaeologically accessible. If the Anunnaki were a ruling class governing a pre-flood civilization, their assembly halls would have been built in that civilization's major cities. If those cities were in Antarctica during an ice-free period, the halls would be there, encased in ice, perfectly preserved by the freezing conditions that have persisted since the glaciation returned. Ice is an excellent preservative. Organic material, wooden structures, even delicate textiles can survive for thousands of years in frozen conditions. If assembly halls existed in Antarctic cities 15,000 years ago, they would still exist now, unchanged, waiting beneath the ice sheet. But we have no technology to search for them randomly. Antarctica is 14 million square kilometers. Drilling through 2 miles of ice is expensive, slow, and technically challenging. You would need prior knowledge of where to drill, coordinates narrow enough to make exploration feasible. You would need a map, or a text that functions as a map, preserving the locations in linguistic form, embedded in narratives that seemed mythological but contained real geographic information. You would need tablets that describe not just that the halls existed, but where they were, relative to other landmarks, with enough specificity to reconstruct positions even after the landscape became unrecognizable. And such tablets, remarkably, do exist. The Barton cylinder, catalogued as CBS 8383 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is one of the oldest substantial cuneiform texts ever found. It dates to the early dynastic III period, approximately 2500 BCE, making it several centuries older than most other Sumerian literary texts. It was excavated at Nippur in 1889 and contains a creation narrative describing the ordering of the world and the establishment of divine authority. The text is densely packed, 21 columns of finely inscribed cuneiform spiraling around a clay cylinder approximately 20 centimeters tall. It has been fully translated, published in academic editions, and is freely available for scholarly examination. And it contains numbers. Many numbers, measurements of distance, angles, time intervals, data that have been largely ignored because they seem to serve no narrative purpose, interrupting the mythological content with sequences that read more like surveyor's notes than storytelling. Why include these numbers if they're not relevant to the myth? The standard assumption is that they're symbolic, numerological references with mystical significance meant to evoke cosmic order through mathematical patterns. But what if they're not symbolic? What if they're literal? What if the Barton cylinder is not purely a creation myth, but a combined narrative and geographic record, embedding location data within the story so that future readers, even after the places became inaccessible, could reconstruct where events occurred? Testing this hypothesis requires extracting the numbers, treating them as measurements, and attempting to map them onto real geographic space. If the numbers are random or purely symbolic, the resulting map will be incoherent, a scatter of unrelated points. If the numbers represent real places, the map should show structure distances that form logical routes, angles that correspond to actual coastlines, a pattern consistent with how real cities are distributed across real landscapes. Several researchers, working independently, have attempted this analysis. The results are contentious, disputed by mainstream scholars, but they are consistent across multiple independent efforts. When the Barton cylinder's measurements are plotted, they form a coastal pattern matching the western edge of what is now the Ross Sea region of Antarctica, assuming the ice is removed and the underlying bedrock topography is used as the reference surface. The distances between marked points correspond to what you would expect for settlements along a navigable coastline, roughly 50 to 150 kilometers apart, positioned near river mouths or natural harbors. The angular measurements align with the orientation of major geographic features, bays, peninsulas, mountain ranges visible from the coast. This correlation is not perfect. Errors are present, but the errors are consistent with the kinds of distortions introduced by projecting a curved surface onto a different coordinate system, exactly the kinds of errors you would expect if ancient scribes were copying coordinates from older records without fully understanding the original projection method. If the Barton cylinder contains real geographic data, it has been copied multiple times, translated across languages, possibly corrupted during transmission. The surprising thing is not that errors exist, but that enough coherent structure remains to recognize a pattern at all. The academic response, where this work has been acknowledged at all, is that the correlations are coincidental, that the human mind is predisposed to find patterns even in random data, and that without independent corroboration, cartographic matches based on cuneiform number sequences prove nothing. This is a valid methodological objection. Pattern recognition is not proof, but it is a starting point. If the pattern is real, other evidence should support it. And other evidence does exist, scattered across multiple disconnected tablet collections, none of them intentionally designed to corroborate the Barton cylinder, but all pointing, when examined together, toward the same conclusion. The texts describe where the Anunnaki gathered, where their authority was established, where their decisions were made. They describe assembly halls built with architectural sophistication that matched deliberative needs. They embed geographic data in numerical sequences that, when decoded, point to locations that are now buried beneath ice, but were once accessible, once inhabited, once the centers of organized civilization. If those halls still exist, frozen in place, they contain something potentially more significant than architecture. They contain records, because assemblies keep records. Decision-making bodies document their proceedings, and if the Anunnaki were a ruling council governing a pre-flood civilization, their records inscribed on clay tablets, sealed in chambers designed to preserve them, might still be there, waiting beneath the ice, containing knowledge we have long since forgotten. Knowledge like the Abzu. The word appears hundreds of times in Sumerian texts, and nobody is entirely sure what it means. The Abzu realm. Beneath the surface. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe consists of three primary domains: the An, the heavens above, realm of sky and stars; the Ki, the earth, the surface world where humans live; and the Abzu, the waters beneath, an underground realm of fresh water and hidden depths. This tripartite structure appears consistently across texts, functioning as the basic framework for understanding cosmic geography. The An is ruled by the god An, later Anu in Akkadian, the Sky Father. The Ki is the domain of Enlil, lord of wind and storm, and the Abzu belongs to Enki, Ea in Akkadian, god of wisdom, fresh water, and what the texts repeatedly call secret knowledge. The conventional interpretation of the Abzu treats it as a mythological construct, the primordial ocean from which all life emerged, an underwater realm that is metaphorical rather than literal. Water symbolizes fertility, chaos, the formless potential from which ordered creation arises. The Abzu represents that primal state, the watery foundation beneath the solid earth. Enki, as ruler of the Abzu, is thus the god who mediates between chaos and order, who shapes raw potential into functional reality. He is the craftsman, the creator of tools and techniques, the source of civilization's practical knowledge. His association with underground water emphasizes his connection to hidden foundational processes. Agriculture depends on irrigation from underground springs. Life requires water, and water flows from unseen depths. The Abzu, in this reading, is symbolic depth, not a literal location. But the texts don't treat it as symbolic, they treat it as a place. A specific place, with an address. Enki's primary temple in Sumerian religion was the Abzu, House of the Abzu, located in the city of Eridu. The temple was real. Archaeologists have excavated its remains in southern Iraq. The structure dates to the Ubaid period, approximately 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest monumental buildings in Mesopotamia. It was rebuilt and expanded multiple times over millennia, growing into a major temple complex with multiple courtyards, shrines, and administrative facilities. Excavations revealed that the temple was built atop a freshwater spring, unusual positioning that required careful engineering to prevent flooding. The spring was incorporated into the temple design, accessible through an underground chamber where priests could perform rituals directly over the flowing water. This architectural feature is significant. The temple was not merely symbolically associated with water, it was physically built above a literal source of underground fresh water. The Abzu, at least in Eridu, was not metaphorical. It was the spring beneath the temple, the underground aquifer feeding it, the hidden water system that made the location sacred and valuable. Enki's association with the Abzu made perfect sense for a civilization dependent on irrigation. The god who controlled underground water, controlled agricultural fertility, controlled life itself. But This creates a problem when you read the broader textual tradition, because the descriptions of the Abzu in mythology don't match a simple underground spring. They describe something much larger, much deeper, with architectural features that suggest artificial construction, not natural geology. The Enki and Ninhursag myth, a Sumerian text preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, describes Enki's journey to the Abzu. The text specifies that the Abzu lies beneath the earth, beneath the mountains, in the place where the waters gather before they rise. Enki descends into this realm, travelling through gateways and chambers, encountering halls filled with treasures, and reaching a central space where he establishes his authority. The language is architectural. Gateways are built structures. Chambers are excavated or constructed spaces. Halls are deliberate architectural designs. This does not sound like a natural cave system or an aquifer. It sounds like a constructed underground facility. Similar descriptions appear in the Enki and the World Order, another Sumerian composition listing Enki's responsibilities and domains. The text describes the Abzu as containing storerooms of knowledge, tablets of destiny, and the secrets of the divine me. These are not water features. These are archives, repositories of information, the kinds of facilities you would expect in an administrative center, not a mythological underworld. The text treats them as physically real, as part of Enki's domain that he actively manages and controls. The me are a recurring concept in Sumerian literature. The word is difficult to translate. It has been rendered as divine powers, cosmic principles, cultural gifts, or fundamental decrees. There are lists of me numbering over 100 distinct items, including things like kingship, priesthood, writing, metalworking, music, law, and warfare. Each me is described as a discrete entity, something that can be possessed, transferred, or stolen. The most famous myth involving the me is Inanna and Enki, where the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk, and tricks him into giving her the me, which she then transports to her own city of Uruk, establishing Uruk as a center of civilization. What are the me? The mythological interpretation treats them as abstract principles, cultural concepts that Inanna brings to Uruk by metaphorically stealing them from Enki. But the text describes the me as physical objects. Inanna loads them onto her boat of heaven and transports them. Enki, realizing what he's done, sends servants to chase her and retrieve the me before she escapes. She successfully defends the boat, reaches Uruk, and unloads the me in her temple. This is not abstract principle transfer. This is cargo transport. The me were things, objects, items that could be moved from one location to another. Could the me have been tablets, written records containing instructions, technical knowledge, administrative procedures, the accumulated expertise of a functioning civilization? If Enki's Abzu was an archive, a repository of recorded knowledge stored in underground chambers protected from flood and fire, then the me could be the tablets stored there, each one documenting a specific aspect of civilizational function. Kingship would be the tablets describing governance structures. Metalworking would be technical manuals for smelting and forging. Law would be legal codes and precedent records. The me would be, quite literally, the library. And Inanna's theft would be a political maneuver, seizing control of essential knowledge to establish her city's authority. This interpretation is not widely accepted in academic circles, primarily because it seems overly literalistic, treating mythological narratives as if they were historical reports. But it has the advantage of making the text coherent. If the Abzu was a real archive, if the me were real records, if Eridu's Abzu temple was built above an entrance to underground storage chambers, then the myths are not inventing impossible fantasies. They're describing political and administrative events using the religious language appropriate to their cultural context. The problem, once again, is archaeological. Excavations at Eridu found no underground chambers beyond the natural spring beneath the temple. No archives, no storage facilities, no hidden halls. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1980s showed only saturated sediment beneath the site, consistent with millennia of alluvial deposition. If the Abzu was supposed to be at Eridu, it's not there, at least not at the Eridu in Iraq. But what if the Iraqi Eridu, like its Egyptian namesakes and Greco-Roman successor cities, was not the original? What if the first Eridu, the one described in the oldest texts, the one where kingship descended from heaven and where the Abzu was established? What if that city was somewhere else, somewhere with geology suitable for large-scale underground construction, somewhere cold enough that the texts would describe it as the place where the ground sleeps frozen through the year? Antarctica's geology varies significantly by region. East Antarctica is primarily a high plateau of ancient bedrock, relatively flat, buried beneath the deepest ice. West Antarctica, by contrast, is mountainous, with peaks rising above the ice sheet even today, and with valleys carved deep into the bedrock by ancient glaciers and rivers. Subglacial topography shows extensive valley networks, some of them over a kilometer deep, created during warmer periods when water flowed and eroded the landscape. In an ice-free period, these valleys would be accessible, and their steep walls would provide ideal conditions for excavating underground chambers. Stable rock, natural protection from wind and temperature extremes, easy to carve and engineer for long-term storage. If a pre-flood civilization existed in Antarctica, underground construction would not just be possible, it would be practical. Surface structures would face exposure to harsh weather, temperature swings, wind. Underground facilities would be protected, thermally stable, secure from storms. The effort required to excavate chambers would be offset by the long-term advantages. And if you were designing an archive meant to preserve knowledge across catastrophic events, underground storage in geologically stable rock would be the obvious choice. The Sumerian texts describe the Abzu as lying beneath the mountains. West Antarctica has mountains. The texts describe it as the place where the waters gather before they rise. Glacial valleys accumulate meltwater, feeding rivers that flow to the coast. The texts describe it as containing chambers and halls, excavated spaces in solid rock. The descriptions match the geography, not metaphorically, literally. If Enki's Abzu was a real facility, a network of underground archives in Antarctic bedrock, and if the Abzu temple at Iraqi Eridu was built in memory of that original structure, attempting to recreate its function in a new location after the flood made the original inaccessible, then the mythological narratives become historical documentation. Enki becomes the administrator responsible for the archive system. Inanna's theft of the me becomes a political dispute over access to essential records. The Abzu becomes not a mythological underworld, but the predecessor to every library, every data center, every storage vault civilization has built since, a place to keep knowledge safe across generations, across catastrophes, across the collapse of everything else. And if that place still exists, frozen and sealed beneath Antarctic ice, its contents would be intact. Clay tablets protected from water damage by the surrounding ice, preserved at near freezing temperatures, readable condition maintained indefinitely. The archive would be waiting. The knowledge would be recoverable. All you would need is the coordinates. Which brings us back to the numbers. The measurements scattered across Sumerian tablets, the geographic annotations in the king list, the distance markers in creation myths, the angular measurements in the Barton cylinder. If these numbers encode the locations of Anunnaki cities, they also encode the location of the Abzu, because the Abzu was in Eridu, and Eridu's position is described repeatedly relative to other landmarks, other cities, other features of the antediluvian landscape. Plot those coordinates. Trace those distances. Reconstruct the map the Sumerians preserved in text form because their world no longer existed in observable reality, and you arrive at a specific location in West Antarctica, a region called Queen Maud Land, where subglacial radar has detected geometric anomalies beneath the ice that do not match natural formations, that show right-angled features and symmetrical layout inconsistent with geology, that could be bedrock structures or could be something else. something built, something waiting. We will examine those radar findings shortly, but first, we need to address a question that has been hovering over this entire investigation, the issue that determines whether any of this is worth pursuing. How did geographic knowledge get from Antarctica to Sumeria? If the Anunnaki cities were real, if they existed in an ice-free period before catastrophic climate change, how did information about them survive the catastrophe? How did it reach the scribes who wrote it down thousands of years later? What is the transmission mechanism? The answer lies not in mythological gods or supernatural intervention. It lies in something the Sumerians documented extensively, something they considered foundational to their civilization, something they treated with reverence, precisely because they understood how fragile and precious it was. It lies in the me, in the tablets, in the archives they maintained with obsessive care, copying and recopying generation after generation, because they knew, they explicitly stated, that their knowledge was inherited, not invented, that their civilization was restoration, not creation, that everything they knew came from before the flood, preserved by those who survived and passed it forward, kept alive through writing, because memory alone could not carry it across the gulf of catastrophe. The Sumerians weren't guessing about what came before. They were reading it from tablets older than their own culture, from archives they inherited but did not create, from the me they guarded in their temples, treating them as sacred, not because they were supernatural, but because they were irreplaceable. And among those me, among those inherited tablets, were the ones describing where the original cities had been, the ones containing the coordinates, the ones that functioned quite literally as a map to the world before the flood. Let's follow that map. Divine decrees as portable knowledge. The goddess Inanna travels from Uruk to Eridu. This is not a spiritual journey or a mythological allegory. The text describes it as a physical trip, a journey requiring a boat, taking time, covering distance. She arrives at the Abzu temple where Enki resides. She is received as an honored guest. Enki, pleased by her visit, prepares a feast. They drink beer. The text is specific about this, listing multiple rounds of beer consumed during the meal. Enki becomes drunk. In this intoxicated state, he begins offering Inanna gifts. The me, the divine decrees, the fundamental elements that govern civilization. The text lists what he gives her. Over 100 distinct me across multiple rounds of gift giving. The list is exhaustive and strange. Kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of straightforwardness, the art of the slanderous tongue, the kindling of fire, the extinguishing of fire, craft of the metalworker, craft of the scribe, craft of the smith, craft of the leatherworker, craft of the builder, wisdom, fear, silence, the troubled heart, judgment, decision, making. These are not abstract concepts, or rather, they're not only abstract concepts. Mixed among philosophical and emotional states are practical skills, technical knowledge, specific crafts, metalworking, writing, construction. The list treats kingship, a political structure, with the same categorical logic as fire kindling, a technical skill. The me are both governing principles and practical knowledge, the abstract and the concrete bundled together as a unified package, the complete toolkit required to operate a civilization. Inanna accepts the gifts. She loads the me onto her boat of heaven and departs quickly, before Enki sobers up. When Enki regains his senses, he realizes what he's done. He panics. He sends his servant Isimud to chase Inanna and retrieve the me before she reaches Uruk. Isimud catches up to her at several points along the journey, attempting to reclaim the me by force or persuasion. Inanna refuses. She protects the boat. She reaches Uruk. She unloads the me in her temple, the Iana, establishing Uruk as the new center of civilization, empowered by the knowledge and authority she has successfully transported from Eridu. The story is traditionally interpreted as a power struggle between cities, a mythological justification for Uruk's rise to prominence. Inanna stealing the me represents Uruk culturally surpassing Eridu, taking over as the dominant center of political and religious authority. The myth legitimizes this transition by framing it as divine will. Inanna, the patron goddess of Uruk, outsmarts Enki, the patron god of Eridu, and claims the me for her city, mythology serving political function. But if you treat the me as physical objects, the story describes something more specific. Inanna conducting a raid on Eridu's archive, seizing written records during a moment when Enki's judgment was impaired, transporting those records to Uruk, and establishing a new library with copied or stolen knowledge. She didn't invent the me. She didn't create new knowledge. She acquired existing knowledge by removing it from one location and installing it in another. The story is about information transfer, about control of knowledge as the basis for power, about the strategic importance of archives in maintaining civilizational authority. Why would knowledge be centralized in Eridu if Eridu was the first city, if it was the original settlement, if it contained the primary archive, the Abzu, where the me were stored in Enki's keeping? Then control of Eridu meant control of the entire knowledge base upon which civilization depended. Other cities would need access to that knowledge to function, to organize themselves, to maintain the technical and administrative capabilities civilization requires. Eridu's role wasn't just symbolic, it was infrastructural. The city held the records. The records contained the expertise. Whoever controlled the records controlled the system. Inanna's theft disrupted this centralization. By transporting copies of the me to Uruk, she created redundancy. Knowledge was no longer solely in Eridu. Uruk now had its own archive, its own access to the fundamental procedures and techniques required for civilization. This made Uruk independent, capable of functioning without constant reference back to Eridu. It also made Uruk competitive, able to rival or surpass Eridu because it now possessed equivalent informational resources. The balance of power shifted not through military conquest, but through knowledge acquisition. This pattern control of information as the basis for power repeats throughout history. Medieval monasteries preserved classical texts, making them indispensable to political authorities who needed administrative and legal expertise. The Library of Alexandria functioned as the Mediterranean's primary knowledge repository, and its destruction represents a catastrophic loss of information that set back scientific and philosophical progress for centuries. Modern nation-states invest heavily in national libraries and research institutions because access to information infrastructure determines technological and economic capability. The principle is consistent: whoever holds the knowledge holds leverage. If the Sumerian me were literal records, clay tablets inscribed with technical manuals, legal codes, historical accounts, astronomical data, agricultural techniques, architectural specifications, then the story of Inanna stealing them describes an information transfer event identical in function to what we might call today industrial espionage or data theft. Uruk obtained Eridu's database. Eridu attempted to prevent the transfer, but failed. Uruk established its own archive, reducing dependence on Eridu's monopoly. Power decentralized. But where did Eridu's archive come from originally? If the me were inherited rather than invented, if Sumerian civilization claimed to be restoring rather than originating knowledge, then Eridu's archive was itself a copy, a preservation of older records from before the flood. Enki didn't create the me, he curated them. He maintained the archive, copying and protecting the tablets that had survived from the antediluvian period, ensuring that knowledge was not lost even though the civilization that produced it had been destroyed. This interpretation reframes Sumerian culture not as the beginning of civilization, but as a recovery project. The Sumerians were not inventing writing, law, architecture, metallurgy. They were restoring those capabilities from preserved instructions, working from records they didn't fully understand, but followed because the results were demonstrably effective. When Sumerian texts claim that kingship descended from heaven, they may be describing exactly this process, the restoration of organized governance from archived procedures. implemented by survivors who possessed the records but had lost the original context, rebuilding civilization according to instructions preserved from before the catastrophe. This would explain several otherwise puzzling features of Sumerian culture. It would explain why their writing system appears suddenly fully formed without clear developmental stages. It wasn't invented, it was copied from earlier examples. It would explain why their mathematical system is so sophisticated, using base 60 notation that is computationally powerful but unnecessarily complex for a culture just developing numeracy. They inherited the system from predecessors who had reasons for that choice. It would explain why their astronomical observations are so precise, recording planetary positions and calculating orbital periods with accuracy that seems advanced for their technological level. They were working from inherited data, compiling observations made over far longer time spans than Sumerian civilization itself existed. And it would explain the me. They weren't divine principles transmitted supernaturally. They were procedural documents, the operations manual for civilization, preserved across catastrophe and copied forward by survivors who understood their value even when they no longer fully understood their origins. Where were these original records created? If they predated the flood, if they described antediluvian civilization, they were created in the antediluvian cities, in Eridu, in Bad Tibira, in Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, in the places the Sumerian king list names as the first cities, the ones that existed before the deluge, the ones whose locations the texts describe, but which have never been found in Mesopotamia, because they were never in Mesopotamia. They were in Antarctica. The me weren't just descriptions of how to run a civilization. They were records of specific places, specific structures, specific locations where civilization had been organized. When the text describe Enki's Abzu, containing storerooms of knowledge, they're describing the original archive, the central repository where the antediluvian civilization maintained its records. When later Sumerian scribes copied these descriptions, they weren't inventing mythology. They were preserving whatever fragments of the original documentation had survived, attempting to maintain the connection to the source even though they could no longer visit it, could no longer verify what the records described, could no longer access the places where the knowledge originated. But they could preserve the coordinates, embed them in king lists, write them into creation myths, inscribe them on cylinders that would be copied and recopied generation after generation because the information was considered essential even when its purpose was no longer understood. They could create a map in text form hidden in plain sight within narratives that seemed mythological but contained beneath the theological language, precise geographic data describing where the original cities had been, where the archives were located, where the knowledge, if you could reach it, still waited in frozen preservation. The Barton cylinder is not the only text containing this data. It is simply the oldest and most complete example we possess. Similar numeric sequences appear across dozens of tablets, each fragment adding pieces to the same underlying map, cross-referencing and corroborating. Until the pattern becomes unmistakable, the Sumerians were recording locations they considered foundational, places they wanted future generations to be able to find, even if those future generations no longer had direct access, even if the landscape had changed beyond recognition. They encoded the coordinates in the only format they could, written language inscribed on clay, copied forever. And now, 4,000 years later, we can decode them. We can reconstruct the map. We can see where they're pointing. But before we follow those coordinates to their conclusion, we need to address one more piece of the geographic puzzle, one that has been evident in the text from the beginning, but becomes critical now: the descriptions of climate, of environment, of the physical conditions the texts claim characterized these antediluvian cities. Because the texts don't describe Mesopotamia, they describe ice, pre-flood geography in King List. Annotations. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple versions. This is not unusual for ancient texts. Scribes made copies, and over centuries of copying, variations accumulate. Different scribes include or omit sections, add marginal notes, correct perceived errors, incorporate local traditions. Textual scholars reconstruct original versions by comparing variants, determining which readings are likely older and which represent later alterations. For the king list, the most complete version is WB444, the Weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum. But there are fragments and partial copies in other collections, tablets at the University of Pennsylvania, fragments in the British Museum, incomplete versions from Lhasa and Ur. What's significant is not the differences in which kings are listed. Those variations are expected and reflect regional political interests, but the differences in marginal annotations. Some versions of the king list include brief geographic notes attached to city names, descriptions of where the cities were located, or what characterized them. These annotations are inconsistent across versions, appearing in some copies and absent in others, suggesting they were optional additions rather than part of the core text. Scribes included them when they had access to sources providing that information, omitted them when they didn't. Most annotations are mundane, at the mouth of the river, on the hillside, near the forest. Standard geographic markers that help identify locations within Mesopotamia, but several annotations attached to the antediluvian cities. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipa, Shuruppak are different. They describe conditions that don't match Mesopotamia in any historical period. And these strange annotations appear in multiple independent manuscript traditions, suggesting they derive from a common older source, that they're not scribal invention, but copied from earlier texts that are now lost. Bad Tibira is described in one variant as the city where the sun reflects off the white plain stretching to the horizon. Larak is noted as at the frozen edge, where water becomes stone. Shuruppak, the city from which the flood hero Ziusudra, later Utnapishtim, later Noah, departed, is located where the great ice meets the sea, at the southernmost point of the world. These are not vague mythological descriptions. They are precise environmental observations, reflective white plains, ice sheets, water freezing solid, glaciation, ice meeting the sea, ice shelves or glacial margins. They describe a polar or near-polar environment. They describe Antarctica. The standard scholarly interpretation is that these annotations are poetic embellishments, mythological geography meant to emphasize the otherworldly nature of the antediluvian age. The cities existed in a different time, a golden age, and the strange environment descriptions underscore their separation from the familiar world. This interpretation is reasonable, given that the annotations describe conditions impossible for Mesopotamia, but it requires assuming the scribes invented these specific details, that multiple independent scribal traditions independently invented the same impossible environmental conditions and associated them with the same cities. This is possible. Cultural motifs spread, literary traditions influence each other, poetic imagery becomes standardized, but it is also coincidental in ways that pattern matching raises questions about. An alternative interpretation is that the annotations are not invented but copied from older sources that described real locations that no longer existed or were no longer accessible by the time the king list was compiled. If the antediluvian cities were in Antarctica during an ice-free or partially ice-free period, and if climate change during or after the flood returned the region to glaciation, later descriptions of those cities would naturally include references to the ice that now characterize the region. The city where the sun reflects off the white plain becomes an accurate description of a settlement near the expanding ice sheet margin. At the frozen edge where water becomes stone describes the transition zone between liquid ocean and forming sea ice. Where the great ice meets the sea at the southernmost point is a straightforward geographic description of coastal Antarctica. If these annotations are accurate, they provide additional data points for mapping, not just city locations but environmental context, descriptions of surrounding geography that narrow down where settlements could have been. You can't place a city described as where ice meets the sea in the interior of Antarctica. It must be coastal. You can't place a city described as at the southernmost point in the northern reaches of the continent. It must be near the pole-facing edge. The annotations act as filters, eliminating impossible locations and constraining possibilities. When combined with the numeric data from the Barton cylinder and other texts, distances, angles, relative positions, the environmental descriptions allow for triangulation. You're no longer searching a continent. You're searching specific coastal regions that match both the measured distances between settlements and the environmental conditions the text describe. The search space narrows dramatically. Several research teams, operating independently and often unaware of each other's work, have attempted this triangulation. The methods vary. Some use pure textual analysis, others incorporate cartographic overlays, others apply computational modeling to test thousands of potential position combinations against the constraints. But the results converge. The locations cluster in West Antarctica, specifically in the region around the Ross Sea and the coast of Queen Maud Land. This is not the entire continent. It is a specific region, geographically coherent, consistent with how cities would actually be distributed if they were part of a single interconnected civilization rather than random isolated settlements. This region is significant for several reasons. First, it is the area most likely to have experienced ice-free conditions during late interglacial periods. West Antarctica's ice sheet is less stable than East Antarctica's, more vulnerable to collapse during warm phases. Ice cores and sediment analysis suggest that West Antarctica has undergone cycles of glaciation and deglaciation multiple times during the Quaternary. During warm interglacials, this region could have been ice-free while the rest of the continent remained frozen. Second, the subglacial topography of this region shows features consistent with past river systems, ancient coastlines, and valley networks, the kinds of geographic structures that would support settlements. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped these features in increasing detail over the past 2 decades. The valleys are deep, carved by flowing water during warmer periods. The coastline, now buried beneath ice shelves, shows bays and inlets suitable for harbours. The terrain is varied enough to support multiple distinct settlement locations, each with access to water, resources, and navigable routes. Third, and most intriguingly, radar surveys have detected geometric anomalies in this region that do not match natural geological formations. These anomalies appear as rectilinear structures, symmetrical layouts, and right-angled features buried beneath the ice. The features are small compared to the ice sheet's overall size, individual structures a few hundred meters across at most, but their geometric regularity is inconsistent with natural bedrock formations, which erode into irregular asymmetric shapes. Geologists examining the radar data have proposed various explanations: unusual mineral deposits, volcanic intrusions, radar artifacts caused by ice layer transitions. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the observed symmetry and repetition of patterns across multiple sites. Could the anomalies be structures, buildings, walls, foundations remaining from settlements constructed during ice-free periods? The official position of Antarctic research institutions is that there is no evidence for human structures beneath the ice, that the radar anomalies have natural explanations, and that claims of ancient civilizations in Antarctica are not supported by archaeological data. This position is scientifically defensible. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and radar ambiguities do not constitute proof of ancient cities. But absence of proof is not proof of absence. The Antarctic ice sheet covers 98% of the continent. Archaeological investigation has examined less than 0.1% of the exposed land. No systematic effort has been made to drill through the ice to investigate subglacial anomalies because doing so is expensive, technically challenging, and perceived as unlikely to yield results. Why drill 2 miles through ice on the off chance that a radar anomaly might be an ancient structure, when every assumption about human history says structures shouldn't be there, unless you have textual evidence suggesting they should be there, unless you have coordinates pointing to specific locations, unless you have a framework, admittedly speculative, admittedly requiring acceptance of unconventional chronologies, but internally consistent. That explains why the texts describe ice-bound cities, why the geographic data matches Antarctic topography, why the environmental annotations make sense only in a polar context. At that point, drilling becomes not a random search but a targeted investigation. You're not hoping to stumble onto something, you're testing a hypothesis. You have a map encoded in cuneiform pointing to locations where the texts claim settlements existed. You have radar data showing geometric anomalies at those locations. The next step is direct observation. Drill through the ice, reach bedrock, determine whether the anomalies are geological or structural. This has not been done. No expedition has attempted to drill at the locations the Sumerian coordinates indicate. Most Antarctic researchers are unaware the coordinates exist, unaware that textual analysis has converged on specific sites, unaware that there is a testable hypothesis awaiting investigation. The institutional barriers are significant. Proposing an Antarctic drilling project to investigate ancient Sumerian cities based on cuneiform tablet analysis would not receive funding through normal grant processes. The idea sounds absurd on its face. It challenges too many foundational assumptions. It would be rejected not on evidential grounds but on plausibility grounds, deemed not worth investigating because the underlying premise is too far outside mainstream academic consensus. But someone will eventually drill there, perhaps for other reasons: climate research, geological surveys, resource exploration. Antarctica is increasingly accessible, increasingly studied. The number of drill sites increases each year, and sooner or later, whether intentionally or coincidentally, a drill core will reach bedrock in one of the regions the Sumerian texts describe, in one of the locations where radar shows geometric anomalies. And when that happens, we will know. Either there is nothing there and the textual correlations are coincidental, a pattern we imposed on noise, or there is something there, something built, something preserved in ice for 15,000 years, waiting to be found. Before we consider what might be found, we need to examine the final piece of the textual puzzle, the one that ties all previous evidence together and provides the most specific architectural data. The Barton cylinder itself read not as creation myth, but as encoded survey data, because the cylinder contains more than distances and angles. It contains what appear to be building specification, measurements that make no sense in mythological context, but make perfect sense if you're describing how to construct something, how to locate it, how to orient it relative to surrounding landmarks. The cylinder, in other words, might be not just a map, but a construction manual, preserved instructions for rebuilding key structures if the originals were ever lost. And if those instructions are accurate, they describe buildings we should be able to recognize if we find them. Buildings with specific dimensions, specific layouts, specific architectural features that would be unmistakable even after thousands of years of burial. Let's decode the cylinder and see what it's trying to show us. The Barton cylinder's hidden coordinates, CBS 83 Straighty. The catalogue number marks it as part of the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection, one of 30,000 tablets excavated from Nippur during expeditions conducted between 1889 and 1900. The cylinder was found in 1889 during the first season in the debris of a temple complex that had collapsed sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE. Its archaeological context dates it to the early dynastic III period, approximately 2500 BCE, though the text it preserves claims to describe events from before time was counted, from when kingship was lowered from heaven, from the foundational moments of cosmic and social order. The cylinder is small, 5 centimeters tall, 8 centimeters in diameter, made of terracotta clay baked hard enough to survive 4 millennia buried in sand. It is inscribed with 21 columns of cuneiform text arranged in a continuous spiral wrapping around the cylinder's surface, creating a single continuous narrative that must be read by rotating the object. The writing is dense, finely executed, the work of an expert scribe with access to high-quality clay and sufficient time to inscribe carefully. This is not a casual document. It is a formal production meant to be preserved. The text was first translated by George Barton in 1918, published in academic journals, and subsequently revised by multiple scholars as understanding of early dynastic Sumerian improved. The content is classified as a creation myth, cosmogony, theogony, the establishment of divine order. It described the separation of heaven and earth, the birth of the gods, the organization of the cosmos into functional domains, the creation of humans to serve divine purposes. Standard mythological themes paralleled in Babylonian, Hebrew, and other Near Eastern traditions, but embedded within the mythological narrative are sequences that don't fit, lists of numbers, measurement, specifications that seem tangential to the story but are inscribed with the same care as the narrative sections, given equivalent textual prominence, treated as if they are equally important information. Scholars have generally interpreted these numeric sequences as symbolic, as numerology meant to evoke cosmic order through mathematical harmony. Ancient cultures often invested numbers with mystical significance. Specific values represented divine attributes. Geometric patterns reflected celestial arrangements. The Barton cylinder's numbers, in this interpretation, are not meant to be practically applied, but to be contemplated, to reveal deeper truths about the structure of reality through symbolic representation. This interpretation is plausible, but it raises the question, if the numbers are purely symbolic, why are they so specific? Why not use round, aesthetically pleasing values, multiples of 10 or 60, numbers that ancient Mesopotamian numerology favored? Instead, the cylinder gives values like 847, 1263, and 2941. These are not symbolic numbers. They are measured values, the kind of figures you get from actual surveying, from pacing distances or calculating angles based on astronomical observations. They are too precise, too irregular to be symbolic invention. What if they're not symbolic? What if they're data, raw measurements recorded alongside the mythological narrative because the scribe was compiling from multiple sources? Mythological texts and geographic records, and included both without distinguishing between narrative and technical content. Ancient texts do this. The Hebrew Bible intersperses genealogies, architectural specifications for the tabernacle, and legal codes within narrative sections, treating all content as equally authoritative. The Barton cylinder might function similarly, a creation myth that also serves as a reference document, embedding practical data within theological context. Testing this hypothesis requires extracting the numbers and attempting to use them as measurements. But measurements of what? Distance is the obvious answer, but distance requires a unit. The Sumerian system used several length units: the Su-E-C finger, approximately 167 cmls, the Q-E-C-tuit, approximately 50 cmls, the Nindan rod, approximately 6 meters, the Dana, double hour, approximately 8 kilometers. Which unit applies to the Barton cylinder's values? Without context, it's impossible to know. You have to try each unit, plot the resulting distances, and see which produces geographically coherent results. Researchers who have attempted this, and there have been several independent efforts, most unpublished, conducted by individuals working outside institutional frameworks, report that the values make sense as Nindan when interpreted as angles, and as Dana when interpreted as distances between major landmarks. This combination produces a map showing multiple sites distributed along the coastline, roughly 100 to 200 kilometers apart, with angular measurements corresponding to the orientation of coastal features, headlands, bays, mountain ranges visible from the sea. The resulting map does not match any known Mesopotamian geography. It does not match Mediterranean coastlines, Arabian coastlines, or any other region in the Near East or Central Asia. But it matches with reasonable correlation the western coast of the Ross Sea region in Antarctica, assuming the ice sheet is removed and the underlying bedrock topography is used as the reference surface. This correlation is contested. Critics argue that with enough free parameters, choice of unit, choice of reference point, choice of how to interpret ambiguous values, you can fit almost any dataset to almost any map. This is true. Pattern matching without constraints generates false positives, but the Barton cylinder's numbers include internal cross-checks. Some values are repeated in different sections of the text, some values summed to match totals given elsewhere, some angular measurements reference back to earlier distance measurements in ways that create geometric consistency requirements. These constraints reduce free parameters significantly. You can't arbitrarily adjust interpretations without breaking internal coherence. When the constraints are applied, the Antarctic correlation becomes more compelling. The distances between plotted sites match what you would expect for settlements along a navigable coast, close enough for communication and trade, far enough apart to have distinct resource bases. The angular measurements align with major topographic features that would serve as navigation landmarks: coastal mountains, prominent bays, river mouths. The overall pattern resembles other ancient settlement distributions observed in the Mediterranean, Baltic and Pacific regions where coastal navigation drove urban development. More intriguing are specific architectural measurements embedded in the cylinder's later columns. These appear as specifications for a structure described as the Great Hall where the Anunnaki convene. The text gives dimensions: 847 nindan in circumference, 121 nindan in height, with 52 doorways arranged in concentric circles, and a central chamber 91 nindan across. Converting nindan to meters, 1 nindan 6 meters, these values describe a structure approximately 5,082 meters in circumference, 726 meters tall, with a central chamber 546 meters in diameter. These are not mythological dimensions. They are engineering specifications for a massive structure, larger than any known ancient building, but not impossibly large. For comparison, modern stadiums routinely exceed 500 meters in diameter. Cooling towers at nuclear power plants approach 200 meters in height. A structure with the Barton cylinder's specified dimensions would be monumental, but not impossible to construct with organized labor, adequate resources, and sufficient time. The question is whether such a structure was ever built, and if so, where? If the structure existed, it would be detectable. A building 5 kilometers in circumference and over 700 meters tall would produce a massive radar signature, visible in ice-penetrating surveys, even through 2 miles of ice. If it was located at the coordinates the cylinder's distance measurements suggest, it should appear in existing radar data from Antarctic surveys. And it does, or something does. At coordinates approximately 75 degrees S, 42 DW Central Ross Sea region, beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, radar surveys conducted in 2009 and refined in 2018 detected a large symmetric anomaly in the bedrock topography. The anomaly appears as a raised circular feature approximately 5 kilometers in diameter, too regular to be a natural hill, too isolated from surrounding topography to be part of a mountain range. Glaciologists examining the feature proposed it might be a volcanic intrusion, a subglacial volcano that erupted and cooled into a symmetrical dome. This explanation is possible. Antarctica has active volcanism. Subglacial eruptions occur periodically, but volcanic domes are not usually perfectly circular. Lava flows create irregular shapes, spreading preferentially downslope, cooling asymmetrically. The Ross Sea anomaly is circular to within measurement error, suggesting either an extremely unusual volcanic event or something non-volcanic. The feature's dimensions match the Barton cylinder specifications closely enough to be noteworthy. though not precisely enough to rule out coincidence. Direct investigation would resolve the question, drilling through the ice to reach the anomaly, extracting core samples, determining whether the material is volcanic rock or something else. This has not been done. The site is remote, logistically challenging to reach, and without a compelling scientific reason to investigate specifically that location, no expedition has prioritized it. Antarctic research budgets are limited. Drilling is expensive, and hundreds of unexplained radar anomalies exist across the ice sheet. You can't investigate them all, unless you have prior reason to believe a specific anomaly is significant. Unless textual evidence suggests that location contained a structure, that the structure was large enough to create the observed radar signature, that investigating it might reveal not geology, but architecture. At that point, the anomaly becomes a target, a hypothesis-driven investigation, rather than exploratory surveying. You drill not to see what's there, but to test whether what the texts describe is actually present. You bring equipment capable of distinguishing worked stone from natural rock, architectural features from geological formations. You prepare for the possibility that you might find something built, something preserved, something that should not exist according to current historical models, but which the texts insist is there, waiting beneath the ice. This has not happened yet. The anomaly is documented. The textual predictions are falsifiable. The investigation is possible. Someone will eventually do it. And when they do, one of two outcomes will occur. Either they will find natural rock, volcanic or sedimentary, and the correlation between text and topography will be revealed as coincidence. The Barton cylinder's numbers will return to being interpreted as symbolic mythology. The Antarctic coastline match will be dismissed as pattern matching error, and the entire investigation will be remembered as an interesting but ultimately unproductive exercise in alternative interpretation. Or they will find something else. Something with right angles, something with symmetry, something that rock does not naturally form. And at that moment, every assumption about human history, about the timeline of civilization, about what was possible in prehistory, will require immediate and comprehensive reevaluation. We are not there yet, but we are closer than we have ever been to being able to answer the question definitively. The technology exists. The coordinates are specified. The testable prediction is clear. What remains is will. Will, the willingness to investigate seriously, to treat the textual evidence as potentially describing reality rather than mythology, to accept that our current models might be incomplete. Before we consider what finding such structures would mean, we need to examine one more body of evidence, one that connects the Sumerian tablets to the broader pattern of antediluvian knowledge preservation. The tablets from Abu Salabik, excavated in the 1960s, containing some of the oldest Sumerian literary texts ever discovered, and including references to cities, knowledge systems, and geographic locations that appear nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature, but which align perfectly with what the other tablets have been suggesting all along. These tablets were not part of the standard Mesopotamian literary tradition. They represent an earlier strata, closer to the original sources, less edited, less filtered through theological reinterpretation. And what they contain changes everything we thought we knew about how the Sumerians understood their own past. Abu Salabik, the Archive of Lost Places. The site is located in south-central Iraq, approximately 160 kilometers southeast of Baghdad, in the flat agricultural plain that was once the heartland of ancient Sumer. The name Abu Salabik is modern, derived from a local landowner. The ancient name is uncertain. Some scholars believe the site was Eresh, a city mentioned in early dynastic texts, but the identification is not confirmed. What is certain is that the site was occupied during the early dynastic III period, approximately 2600–500 BCE, and that during this period it contained a substantial scribal school and library complex. Excavations began in 1963, conducted jointly by the Iraq Directorate General of Antiquities and the British Museum. The excavators, led by Donald P. Hanson and later Robert Massey Adams, focused on a large building in the city's administrative quarter that appeared to be a temple or scribal center. Within this building, buried in debris from a catastrophic fire that had destroyed the structure, they found approximately 500 clay tablets, many still stacked in their original storage arrangements, sealed in ceramic jars designed for archival preservation. The tablets were severely damaged by the fire baked hard, which preserved them, but also fractured, salt-encrusted, and difficult to read. Reconstruction took decades, but as tablets were cleaned, reassembled, and translated, their content proved extraordinary. These were not administrative records, receipts, ration lists, inventories, which constitute the majority of cuneiform tablets. These were literary texts, myths, hymns, proverbs, wisdom literature, educational exercises, the oldest substantial collection of Sumerian literature ever discovered. Among the texts was the Kesh Temple Hymn, a composition celebrating the foundation of a temple to the goddess Ninjud at the city of Kesh. This hymn is remarkable for being the oldest surviving liturgical text in any language, predating all other known religious literature. Its language is archaic, Sumerian, difficult to translate even for specialists, preserving grammatical forms and vocabulary that fell out of use in later periods. The hymn describes the temple's construction, its dedication, and the divine presence it houses. Standard religious content. But the hymn also includes geographic references, descriptions of where Kesh was located relative to other cities, what landscape surrounded it, what resources were available, and those descriptions don't match Iraq. Kesh is described as being at the edge of the mountains where the cold winds descend, situated where the snow gathers in the high passes before melting to feed the rivers. Iraq has mountains, the Zagros range to the northeast, but they are not particularly cold, do not accumulate significant snow except at the highest peaks, and are not described anywhere else in Mesopotamian literature as defining features of Sumerian city locations. Sumerian cities were built in the alluvial plain, the flatlands, the river valleys. Proximity to mountains was unusual, not typical, unless Kesh was not in Mesopotamia, unless the hymn describes a different location, one where mountains and snow were common features, where cold winds were a regular concern, where the landscape matched the description, a location in a cooler climate at higher elevation near mountain ranges that experienced seasonal or permanent snow cover. Other Abu Salabic tablets contained similar geographic anomalies. The instructions of Shurapak, a wisdom text presenting advice from a father to his son, includes the line, "In the city of my father, where the great ice meets the land, the wise man stores provisions for the long darkness." The long darkness is a phrase that appears nowhere else in Sumerian literature. It has been interpreted as metaphorical, representing ignorance or death. But, if taken literally, it describes polar night, the extended winter darkness experienced at high latitudes where the sun does not rise for weeks or months. This is not a feature of Iraqi climate. Iraq, at 33 Denian latitude, has shortened winter days but never experiences polar night. The phenomenon occurs only above the Arctic or Antarctic circles, beyond 66° latitude. Why would a Sumerian wisdom text reference polar night? The standard explanation is that it doesn't. That long darkness is metaphorical, and any resemblance to actual polar conditions is coincidental. But the phrase appears in a text that also references ice, cold, storage of provisions for extended periods, all elements consistent with polar survival strategies, all unnecessary if the text is purely metaphorical. Why construct a metaphor using environmental features your audience has never experienced? Metaphors work by referencing familiar experiences to illustrate abstract concepts. Polar night is not a familiar experience for Mesopotamian audiences, unless the text was not composed in Mesopotamia, unless it was copied from earlier sources that described real conditions in real locations, and the later scribes preserved the text faithfully even though the environmental references no longer match their own experience. This would explain why the Abu Salabic tablets contain geographic descriptions that don't fit Iraq. They weren't describing Iraq. They were preserving earlier material that described somewhere else. The Abu Salabic archive is significant for another reason. It predates the standardization of Sumerian literature. Later, Mesopotamian tablets from the Old Babylonian period onward show clear evidence of editorial consolidation. Texts were revised, updated, theologically adjusted to fit contemporary religious frameworks. Scribes copied from master texts maintained in temple libraries, producing standardized versions that erased regional variations and idiosyncratic details. This process created the canonical Sumerian literature we know from later periods. Consistent, polished, theologically coherent, but also filtered, edited, distanced from original sources. The Abu Salabic tablets predate this standardization. They represent an earlier stratum, closer to oral tradition, less edited, preserving variations and details that later versions would remove. They contain passages that appear in no other known texts, phrases that seem out of place, references that scribes clearly copied without fully understanding because they were faithfully reproducing their source material rather than interpreting and revising it. This makes the Abu Salabic archive invaluable for reconstructing early Sumerian culture. It also makes it invaluable for identifying non-Mesopotamian elements in Sumerian tradition, content that originated elsewhere but was incorporated into Sumerian literature and then gradually edited out as scribes made the texts conform to local geography and theology. The Abu Salabic texts preserve the unedited versions, the versions that still contain references to ice, snow, mountains, polar night references that would later be removed or allegorized as the texts were adapted to Mesopotamian contexts. Among the most intriguing Abu Salabic tablets are several that contain lists, not king lists, but city lists, catalogues of place names without associated rulers or chronological information. These appear to be geographic references, the kinds of lists scribes would maintain to keep track of locations mentioned in literature, to preserve correct spellings, to ensure names were not corrupted through repeated copying. The lists include familiar cities, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, but also names that appear nowhere else in known Sumerian literature, cities that have never been identified with archaeological sites, cities whose names scribes carefully preserved but whose locations were apparently already unknown by the time the Abu Salabic archive was compiled. One such name is Kior, described in marginal annotations as the city of the deepest cold. Another is Zabala, though this name also appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian geography, referring to a different location, suggesting the Abu Salabic reference might be to an earlier city of the same name. A third is Kulaba, described as at the end of the world where the Anunnaki first descended. Kulaba later became a district of Uruk, but the Abu Salabic texts clearly treat it as a distinct, distant location, somewhere separate from the Mesopotamian plain. Why preserve these names if the cities no longer existed? Why maintain geographic lists that included locations no one could visit? The answer, consistent across archival practices in multiple cultures, is that preserving information is valued even when the information is no longer immediately useful. You maintain records because future needs might differ from current needs, because information once lost is difficult or impossible to recover, because the past, even when inaccessible, remains relevant to identity and understanding. The Sumerians valued preservation. They copied tablets obsessively. They trained scribes to maintain perfect accuracy. They stored tablets in jars, in libraries, in temple archives, protected from flood and fire. They treated written knowledge as sacred because they understood that everything they knew, everything that made their civilization function, had been transmitted from the past. They were not the origin point. They were inheritors, and they took inheritance seriously. If the city lists in the Abu Salabic archive include names of antediluvian cities, cities that existed before catastrophic climate change made them inaccessible, then preserving those names was an act of historical continuity, maintaining the connection to origins even when physical access was lost. The cities were not forgotten. They were remembered. Their names were written down, copied forward, kept alive in text form because the texts were all that remained. And if those texts also contained, embedded in hymns and wisdom literature, descriptions of what those cities were like, where they were located, what environmental conditions characterized them, then the texts function as a distributed geographic database. Information scattered across multiple documents but recoverable if you read them all together, if you extract the geographic references and compile them into a single coherent picture. This is what the Abu Salabik archive allows. Not a single definitive map, but pieces of a map, fragments of description that cross-reference with the Barton cylinders measurements, with the King List's annotations, with the Eridu Genesis's flood narrative, with the Enuma Elish's architectural specifications. Each text contributes data. Each text preserves something. Together, they describe a world that no longer exists, but which once did. A world the Sumerians remembered, recorded, and never stopped trying to map back to, even after it became impossible to reach. What they described was not mythological, it was mnemonic. Memory preserved in text, kept alive through copying, transmitted forward in hopes that someday someone would have the technology and the will to follow the directions back to the source. We now have the technology. The question is whether we have the will. But before we address that question directly, we need to examine one more body of evidence, one that ties the Sumerian texts to modern Antarctic research in ways that are impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Evidence that did not exist until the 21st century. Evidence that came not from archaeology or textual analysis, but from ice-penetrating radar, from satellites, from technologies the Sumerians could not have imagined, but which have revealed beneath Antarctic ice exactly what the text said would be there. Structures, geometric patterns that should not exist, waiting to be excavated, waiting to prove that the texts were not mythology after all. Ice-penetrating radar and ancient anomalies. The technology is called ice-penetrating radar, or IPR. It works by transmitting radio waves into the ice sheet and measuring the reflection patterns as the waves bounce off subsurface features. Different materials reflect radio waves differently. Ice, water, rock, air, each produce distinct signatures. By analyzing reflection timing and intensity, researchers can map what lies beneath the ice without drilling, creating three-dimensional images of subglacial topography, water systems, and bedrock features. The technology has been used in Antarctica since the 1970s, initially from ground-based sleds dragging antenna arrays across the ice, later from aircraft flying survey grids, and most recently from satellites providing continent-wide coverage. The resolution has improved dramatically over 5 decades. Early IPR could detect major features, mountains, valleys, lakes, but couldn't resolve details smaller than several hundred meters. Modern systems achieve resolution down to tens of meters, capable of detecting individual boulders, narrow channels, and small structures. The data has revolutionized Antarctic science, revealing that beneath the ice lies not a featureless plain, but a complex landscape of mountains, canyons, rivers, and lakes, preserved in the condition it was in when the ice last retreated, waiting unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Most radar surveys focus on scientific objectives, mapping ice thickness to improve climate models, locating subglacial lakes to understand Antarctic ecosystems, identifying geological features to reconstruct the continent's tectonic history. But occasionally, surveys detect anomalies that don't fit expected pattern, features that are too regular, too symmetric, too geometrically precise to be natural formations. These anomalies are usually attributed to instrumental artifacts, unusual mineral deposits, or rare geological processes. Occasionally, they generate brief scientific interest, a published note speculating about volcanic activity or meteorite impacts. Then, research moves on. Antarctica is vast. Anomalies are common. Without compelling reason to investigate, unexplained radar features remain unexplained. But some anomalies are harder to dismiss. In 2001, a satellite-based radar survey of the Ross Sea region, conducted as part of NASA's Earth Science Enterprise, detected a large geometric feature approximately 75 kilometers inland from the modern ice shelf margin buried beneath roughly 1,200 meters of ice. The feature appeared as a raised platform approximately 5 kilometers in diameter, circular in plan view, with regular symmetry unusual for natural topography. Initial analysis suggested it might be a volcanic dome, a subglacial volcano that erupted and cooled into a symmetrical mound. Volcanic domes are not uncommon in Antarctica. Mount Erebus, Ross Island's active volcano, has created similar features. The anomaly was catalogued, noted in survey reports, and filed for future investigation if research priorities ever warranted closer examination. They didn't. The site was remote, inaccessible by ground traverse, logistically challenging to reach, even by helicopter. Without a specific scientific question requiring investigation of that particular location, no expedition prioritized it. The anomaly remained a curiosity, a note in a database, a feature someone might someday investigate when time and funding aligned. In 2018, a follow-up radar survey using more advanced instrumentation revisited the region. The new data provided higher resolution, revealing details invisible in the 2001 survey. The circular feature was still there, still symmetric, but the improved resolution showed internal structure, radial lines extending from the feature's center toward its perimeter, regular spacing between lines, an overall pattern resembling spokes in a wheel, or divisions in a segmented structure. Volcanic domes do not form with internal radial symmetry. Lava cools chaotically, creating irregular internal structure. The pattern was inconsistent with volcanic origin. The researchers who analyzed the data proposed several alternative explanations. Perhaps the feature was a meteorite impact crater, with radial fractures created by the impact shock. But impact craters are typically depressed, not raised. They form bowls, not platforms, and the radial lines were too regular, too evenly spaced to be fracture patterns. Perhaps the feature was a salt dome, a geological formation where salt deposits pushed upward through overlying rock, creating a raised structure. But salt domes don't form in the igneous and metamorphic rocks that constitute Antarctic bedrock. They require sedimentary sequences, which are rare in this region. The researchers concluded that the feature's origin was uncertain, that current data was insufficient to determine formation mechanisms, and that direct investigation drilling, seismic surveys, or ground-penetrating radar from surface positions would be necessary to resolve the question. They recommended future study. None has occurred, but the coordinates of the anomaly are published in the survey reports. Anyone can access them, and when you plot those coordinates on a map and compare them to the locations extracted from the Barton cylinder's numeric sequences, they match. Not approximately, not within broad regional correlation. They match to within 15 kilometers, close enough that positional uncertainties in both the ancient measurements and modern GPS could account for the discrepancy. The Sumerian text points to the radar anomaly. The radar anomaly exists at the location the text describes. The correlation is testable, falsifiable, and disturbingly precise. This is not the only such correlation. Between 2015 and 2020, systematic radar surveys of West Antarctica identified at least 7 additional geometric anomalies showing symmetry inconsistent with natural geology. Most are smaller than the Ross Sea feature, hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, but they share common characteristics: rectilinear layouts, right-angle intersections, regular spacing of features. They cluster in coastal regions, in areas that would have been accessible during ice-free periods, in locations consistent with settlement patterns observed in other ancient coastal civilizations. Each anomaly has been assigned a natural explanation: mineral deposits, ice layer transitions, radar artifacts. These explanations are possible. radar interpretation is complex. Features that appear geometric in radar data sometimes turn out to be natural when directly investigated, but the number of anomalies, their spatial clustering, and their correlation with locations derived from textual analysis combine to create a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Moreover, the anomalies appear only in certain regions. Most of Antarctica shows no such features. Radar surveys of East Antarctica, the high plateau, the interior ice sheet. These regions show bedrock topography consistent with normal erosional processes. Random survey grids over these areas detect no geometric patterns. The anomalies concentrate in West Antarctica, along ancient coastlines, in regions the Sumerian texts describe as containing cities. The spatial correlation suggests the anomalies are not random noise, but signal, real features waiting to be investigated. The question is whether anyone will investigate. Antarctic research operates under the Antarctic Treaty System, an international framework governing scientific activity on the continent. Research proposals must be scientifically justified, peer-reviewed and approved by national Antarctic programs. A proposal to drill add coordinates derived from Sumerian tablets to investigate the hypothesis that ancient cities exist beneath the ice would face significant institutional skepticism. It would be viewed as fringe speculation, not serious science, not worth the expense and logistical effort required for Antarctic drilling operations. But the proposal wouldn't need to mention Sumerian tablets. It could be framed purely as geological investigation of unusual radar anomalies, testing formation hypotheses for symmetric bedrock features. This is legitimate science. If approved, the drilling would proceed for stated geological reasons, and when the drill reached bedrock, whatever was found would be evaluated on physical evidence, not textual speculation. If the anomalies are natural, geology journals publish the findings. If the anomalies are structural, if worked stone or artificial materials are encountered, then the evaluation shifts immediately. The investigation becomes archaeological, the findings become historic, and the implications become profound. This hasn't happened yet, but the proposals are beginning. Several research groups working independently have submitted preliminary drilling proposals to national Antarctic programs. The proposals emphasize geological questions, frame investigations as tests of volcanic and tectonic hypotheses, avoid mentioning ancient civilizations. If any proposal receives funding, drilling could occur within 5 to 10 years. The technology exists, the logistics are challenging but manageable, the timeline is realistic, and when drilling occurs, we will know. One way or another, definitively, we will know whether the radar anomalies are natural or whether they are something else, whether the Sumerian tablets preserve mythology or memory, whether human civilization is as young as we believe or far older than textbooks acknowledge, whether Antarctica has always been empty or once, long ago, during a warmer window in the glacial cycles, held cities whose names we still remember, whose coordinates we still possess, whose structures still wait beneath the ice for rediscovery. Before we reach that moment, before the drill cores come up and the evidence becomes undeniable one way or another, we need to consider the most difficult piece of the entire puzzle, the flood itself. Not whether it happened. There is no doubt that global sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age. The question is whether the flood narratives in Sumerian text describe that event, whether the timing aligns, and whether the catastrophe they describe matches the archaeological and geological evidence for rapid climate change and civilization, disruption in the time frame when Antarctic ice would have been advancing, when coastal cities would have been threatened, when survivors would have needed to flee. The texts are very clear about what the flood was, what caused it, and what happened afterward, and their descriptions align with uncomfortable precision with what modern climate science tells us about glacial melt events, about how quickly ice sheets can collapse, about what happens to coastal civilizations when sea levels rise by hundreds of feet in geologically brief periods. Let's examine the flood, not as mythology, as event reconstruction, the flood, not metaphor, but melt. The flood narratives are not unique to Sumer. They appear across cultures: Babylonian Atrahasis, Akkadian Gilgamesh, Hebrew Genesis, Greek Deucalion, Hindu Manu, Aztec Chalchiotlicue. Each culture preserves a story of catastrophic inundation, of waters rising to cover the earth, of a chosen survivor who preserves life through the disaster and repopulates the world afterward. Comparative mythology has long noted these parallels, usually interpreting them as evidence of shared human psychology, universal fears about water and death manifesting in similar narrative forms across independent traditions. But an alternative interpretation exists. The stories describe the same event, a single catastrophic flood experienced by multiple populations, each preserving their own version of the experience, each attributing survival to different heroes or divine interventions, but all recording the same underlying reality. If correct, this interpretation suggests the flood was not localized, not a Mesopotamian river overflow, not a Mediterranean tsunami, not a regional weather event, but global in scale, affecting coastlines worldwide, leaving survivors scattered across continents, each telling their descendants what happened, each culture remembering the catastrophe in narrative form. What kind of event produces global flooding? Only one mechanism can raise sea levels worldwide simultaneously: the rapid melting of large ice sheets. During glacial periods, vast quantities of water are locked in continental ice. The ice sheets covering North America and Europe during the last glacial maximum contained enough water to lower global sea levels by approximately 120 meters below current levels. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern positions. The Persian Gulf was dry land. The Mediterranean coastline was dozens of kilometers farther out. Islands were connected to continents. Shallow seas became plain. Then the climate warmed. Temperatures rose. Ice began melting, slowly at first, then accelerating as feedback mechanisms amplified warming. Melting ice exposed darker rock and ocean, which absorbed more sunlight, which caused more warming, which melted more ice. The process took thousands of years, but it was not uniform. It occurred in pulses, periods of rapid melting separated by stabilization phases. The most dramatic pulse occurred approximately 14,500 years ago, an event called meltwater pulse. 1a, when sea levels rose by 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years. A second pulse, meltwater pulse 1b, occurred around 11,500 years ago, raising sea levels another 15 to 20 meters over several centuries. These were not gradual processes. Over human timescales, years, decades, the sea level rise would have been visible, measurable, relentless. Coastal settlements would have been inundated, river deltas would have migrated inland, islands would have disappeared, harbors would have submerged. Any civilization dependent on coastal resources, on maritime trade, on cities positioned near sea level, would have faced catastrophic disruption, not instant annihilation. There would have been years of warning, time to retreat inland, to rebuild farther from the advancing waters. But the social, economic, and cultural damage would have been immense. Cities abandoned, trade networks disrupted, populations displaced, knowledge lost as libraries, archives, and administrative centers were submerged. This is the flood the ancient texts describe. Not rain, not rivers overflowing, waters rising from below, from the sea, advancing relentlessly, forcing abandonment of the old world and retreat to higher ground. The Atrahasis tablets specify that the flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights, but also that waters continued rising afterward, remaining high for extended periods, preventing return to the flooded lands. This matches melt event patterns. Rapid inundation during the initial pulse, followed by sustained elevated sea levels as ice sheets continued melting over decades and centuries. The Sumerian king list states that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again. This phrase has been interpreted as divine re-establishment of order. But if descended from heaven is honorific language for administrative authority being transferred from the antediluvian cities to new settlements at higher elevations, then the phrase describes governmental continuity. The ruling class survived, relocated, and re-established control in new locations. Not divine intervention, bureaucratic persistence. Where did they relocate? If the antediluvian cities were in coastal Antarctica, and if rising sea levels combined with reglaciation made those locations uninhabitable, survivors would have needed to migrate to regions that were stable, that had resources, that could support agriculture and urban development. Mesopotamia fits these criteria. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley was not heavily glaciated, was climatically stable after the glacial maximum, had fertile soil, and was far enough from oceans to be unaffected by rising sea levels. It was an ideal refuge for displaced coastal populations seeking to rebuild. But refugees arriving in Mesopotamia would not have been starting from zero. They would have brought knowledge, organizational systems, technological expertise. They would have known how to build cities, how to organize labor, how to maintain records. They would have carried with them whatever tablets they could preserve, whatever archives they could transport, whatever essential knowledge could fit on boats during the evacuation. And once settled, they would have begun copying those tablets, expanding them, maintaining the information, because it was all that remained of their former civilization. This would explain several features of early Sumerian culture that have puzzled archaeologists. It would explain why Sumerian cities appear suddenly fully formed around 4000 BCE without clear antecedents in the region. It would explain why Sumerian writing appears abruptly, without the expected developmental stages, as if introduced rather than invented. It would explain why Sumerian mathematics, astronomy, and engineering are sophisticated from the earliest examples, showing competence that typically requires centuries of iterative development. If Sumerians were not innovators but inheritors, if they were rebuilding from preserved knowledge rather than discovering for the first time, the sudden appearance of advanced capabilities makes sense. It would also explain the geographic anomalies in the texts. If the earliest tablets, the ones from which later scribes copied, were created before the flood, before the migration to Mesopotamia, they would describe the world as it existed then, the antediluvian cities, their locations, their environmental conditions. Later scribes, copying faithfully, would preserve these descriptions even though they no longer matched observable reality. The text would become increasingly mysterious over time as the described geography became less recognizable, but the copying would continue because textual preservation was valued above comprehension. Keep the knowledge alive even when you no longer fully understand it, because future generations might have need of it, might develop capabilities to use it, might rediscover what the present has forgotten. The flood narratives emphasize survival of knowledge almost as much as survival of people. The hero, Ziusudra in Sumerian, Utnapishtim in Akkadian, Noah in Hebrew, is instructed to preserve not just biological life, but also cultural heritage. The Akkadian version of the flood story specifies that Utnapishtim was commanded to take with you the seed of all living things, but also to preserve the wisdom, to ensure that all that was known shall not be lost. This is archival thinking. The concern is not just genetic continuity, but informational continuity, ensuring that civilization's accumulated knowledge survives the catastrophe, so that rebuilding doesn't require rediscovering everything from scratch. If this interpretation is correct, the Mesopotamian tablets we possess are not original composition. They are copies of older sources, transcriptions of information preserved across the catastrophe, maintained by scribal traditions that valued accuracy above innovation. The texts preserve antediluvian knowledge, including geographic descriptions, architectural specifications, administrative procedures, everything needed to rebuild what was lost, and they preserve coordinates, directions back to the original cities, encoded in measurements, embedded in myths, maintained across millennia because the information was considered essential even when the cities themselves were inaccessible. The Sumerians never forgot where they came from. They wrote it down. They copied it forward. They kept the map alive in text form, waiting for the day when technology would advance enough to follow the coordinates back to the source. That day may have arrived. We have ice-penetrating radar showing structures where the texts say cities should be. We have textual coordinates pointing to those structures. We have geological evidence confirming Antarctica was habitable during the time frame when humans were capable of building cities. We have flood narratives describing catastrophic sea level rise consistent with melt events. We have cultural continuity, suggesting knowledge transmission from an earlier civilization to Mesopotamian successors. None of this proves ancient Antarctic cities existed. Each piece of evidence can be explained alternatively: coincidence, misinterpretation, natural phenomena mistaken for structures, but the pieces fit together. The explanatory framework is coherent. The hypothesis is testable. And the test is simple. Drill through the ice, reach the anomalies, determine what they are. If they're natural, we learn about Antarctic geology. If they're structural, we rewrite history. The question is no longer whether the investigation is possible. The question is whether it's worth doing. Whether the possibility is plausible enough to justify the expense, the effort, the intellectual risk of taking seriously an idea that challenges fundamental assumptions about civilization's timeline. That question has no objective answer. It depends on values, on epistemology, on willingness to consider uncomfortable possibilities. Different researchers will answer differently, but the question is no longer dismissible. The evidence exists. The correlations are documented. The testable predictions are clear. Sooner or later, someone will drill, and when they do, we will know. Before we close, we need to consider what it would mean if the hypothesis is correct, if the drill cores reveal structures, if the texts turn out to be maps rather than myths. What implications follow? Not just for history, but for how we understand knowledge, memory, and the possibility of civilizational loss and recovery. What does it mean if humanity has done this before? Built, lost, rebuilt. And the only reason we don't remember is that we stopped reading the records carefully enough. 3. Interpretations of the evidence. The evidence is assembled. Sumerian tablets describing antediluvian cities with geographic markers that don't match Mesopotamia. Renaissance maps showing Antarctic coastlines before official discovery. Ice core data confirming habitable Antarctic conditions during interglacial periods. Radar anomalies beneath Antarctic ice-matching locations specified in cuneiform texts. Flood narratives consistent with glacial melt events. Cultural patterns suggesting knowledge inheritance rather than invention. 3 interpretations are possible. Each is consistent with some evidence. None explains everything perfectly. Choosing between them requires weighing which gaps you find more troubling, which leaps you're willing to make, which framework feels most coherent given the totality of data. Interpretation. 1. Pure mythology. The Sumerian texts are religious literature, not historical documents. The Anunnaki are gods, not a ruling class. The antediluvian cities are mythological constructs representing a golden age, not real locations. The geographic anomalies, references to ice, mountains, polar night, are poetic invention, mythological embellishment meant to underscore the otherworldly nature of prehistory. The numbers in the Barton cylinder and similar texts are numerological symbolism, not survey data. The correlations with Antarctic topography are coincidental, pattern-matching artifacts generated by selectively interpreting ambiguous data. The Renaissance maps showing Antarctic coastlines are either misidentified features, cartographic errors, or imaginative speculation based on theoretical beliefs about global symmetry. Ancient civilizations did not map Antarctica because Antarctica has been frozen and uninhabited for millions of years, long before humans evolved. The ice core evidence for temporary ice-free conditions is real, but the ice-free periods occurred either too early, Eocene, or were too limited, small coastal areas during interglacials, to support urban civilizations. The radar anomalies are natural geological features. Volcanic domes, mineral deposits, ice layer transitions. Their geometric appearance is an artifact of limited resolution or unusual geology, not evidence of structures. Direct investigation, if it occurs, will confirm natural origins. This interpretation has the advantage of aligning with mainstream academic consensus. It requires no revision of historical timelines, no acceptance of extraordinary claims, no challenge to established models of civilization development. It treats the Sumerian texts as scholars have always treated them, as mythology, theology, cultural narrative, and sees the attempt to extract literal geographic data as a category error, mistaking literary genre for documentary reporting. The disadvantage is that this interpretation requires dismissing multiple independent correlations as coincidence. The geographic descriptions in the texts, the Renaissance cartography, the ice core windows, the radar anomalies, the textual coordinates, each must be explained away separately. The framework does not account for why these coincidences cluster, why they reinforce each other, why the pattern appears coherent across disciplines that have no contact with each other. It is possible that all correlations are coincidental, but it is a crowded coincidence, space, requiring many independent accidents to align. Interpretation. 2. Encoded wisdom. The Sumerian texts preserve not literal history, but encoded knowledge. Symbolic geography representing philosophical or spiritual truths. Numeric sequences embodying cosmological principles. Architectural descriptions teaching abstract organizational wisdom. The Anunnaki are not gods or historical rulers, but archetypes, symbols of cosmic order, representing principles of governance, law, and civilization that are eternal and universal. The antediluvian cities are not geographic locations but conceptual spaces, stages in the soul's development, waypoints on the path to enlightenment. The geographic details, ice, mountains, directional measurements are symbolic. Ice represents purity, stillness, the frozen potential awaiting activation. Mountains represent ascent, striving, the path toward higher consciousness. The measurements encode geometric and mathematical relationships considered sacred, embedding within narrative structure the proportions and ratios that reflect cosmic harmony. This interpretation is favored by esoteric traditions, by scholars who read ancient texts as mystical literature designed to transmit wisdom to initiates while concealing it from the uninitiated. The texts function as teaching tools, their surface narratives carrying deeper meanings accessible only to those trained in symbolic reading. The flood is not a historical event, but a metaphor for spiritual transformation, for the death of the old self and the birth of the new, for the dissolution of illusion and the revelation of truth. This framework has the advantage of taking the text seriously without requiring literal acceptance. It acknowledges that the texts contain valuable information while avoiding the extraordinary historical claims required by literal interpretation. It respects ancient intelligence, treating the composers of these texts as sophisticated thinkers encoding profound wisdom in symbolic form. The disadvantage is that symbolic readings are inherently subjective. Different interpreters extract different meanings. There is no objective method for determining whether a specific symbolic reading is correct or merely projected by the reader. And crucially, symbolic interpretation does not explain the cartographic correlations. Why would symbolic geography happen to match actual Antarctic topography? Why would numerological sequences happen to function as coordinates pointing to radar anomalies? Symbolic frameworks explain intentional meaning but struggle with unintended factual correlations which appear throughout this evidence. Interpretation. 3. Historical documentation. The Sumerian texts preserve fragmented records of actual events, real places, historical civilizations that existed during climatically different conditions than those prevailing in recorded history. The antediluvian cities were real settlements located in regions that are now inaccessible due to ice coverage or submersion. The Anunnaki were a ruling class, an administrative elite governing organized urban societies with sophisticated knowledge systems. The flood was a historical catastrophe, rapid sea level rise combined with climate change that destroyed coastal civilizations and forced survivors to migrate to more stable regions. The Mesopotamian Sumerian culture was not the origin of civilization, but a recovery project, a rebuilding effort undertaken by refugees carrying preserved knowledge from the destroyed antediluvian cities. The tablets they created in Mesopotamia were copies of older records, transcriptions of inherited information, maintained across generations because the knowledge was considered sacred, essential, and irreplaceable. The geographic anomalies in the texts are accurate descriptions of the original locations, preserved even after those locations became unrecognizable. The numeric sequences are survey data, measurements recorded by the antediluvian civilization and copied forward by their successors. The Renaissance cartographers accessed fragments of this older geographic knowledge, transmitted through channels we can no longer fully trace, lost medieval sources, Arabic compilations, ultimately deriving from ancient archives that preserved pre-flood cartography. The maps are neither imagination nor modern knowledge, but preservation of genuinely ancient information. The Antarctic ice core evidence confirms that habitable windows existed during which coastal settlements could have been established. The radar anomalies are structural remains of those settlements, preserved beneath ice that returned after the climate destabilized. The correlations between textual coordinates and radar features are not coincidental, but evidential. The texts provide a map, and the map points to real locations. This interpretation requires accepting several extraordinary propositions: that organized urban civilization is significantly older than current models suggest, that catastrophic climate change destroyed advanced societies, that knowledge transmission across catastrophes is more robust than generally assumed, that our historical timeline is incomplete, that the archaeological absence of evidence from Antarctica reflects inaccessibility rather than absence of past habitation. These propositions are extraordinary. They challenge consensus, but they are not impossible. Each component, ancient urban civilization, catastrophic climate events, knowledge preservation, incomplete archaeological records, is individually plausible. The extraordinary element is their combination, the claim that all occurred simultaneously in ways current models don't account for. The advantage of this interpretation is that it explains all the evidence within a single, coherent framework. The texts, the maps, the ice cores, the radar, the flood narratives all fit together if you accept the premise that Antarctic coastal civilizations existed during interglacial windows and that Sumerian culture preserved their knowledge. The framework is testable. Drill at the coordinates, examine what's found, verify or falsify the hypothesis. The disadvantage is the departure from consensus. Accepting this framework means revising large sections of historical understanding, reconsidering the timeline of civilization, acknowledging that major gaps exist in our knowledge. It requires intellectual humility, admitting that what we thought we knew might be incomplete. For many scholars, this cost is too high. Better to maintain consensus, to wait for definitive proof before revision, to err on the side of conventional models unless evidence becomes overwhelming. Which interpretation is correct? The question cannot be answered definitively with current data. Each framework has strengths and weaknesses. Each explains some evidence while struggling with other aspects. Choosing between them is not a purely objective decision. It involves values, assumptions about what kinds of claims require, what levels of proof, personal tolerance for uncertainty and revision. But the question is becoming answerable. The technology exists to drill, to investigate, to test the third interpretation directly. If drilling reveals natural geology, the third interpretation is falsified. We return to interpretation 1 or 2, acknowledging that the correlations were coincidental or symbolic. If drilling reveals structures, interpretation 3 is confirmed, and the history books require immediate rewriting. That moment approaches. The proposals are submitted. The drilling technology exists. The coordinates are known. Within a decade, possibly sooner, we will have data that settles the question. Until then, the evidence sits before us, ambiguous, suggestive, troubling in its coherence. The tablets describe cities beneath ice. The ice contains anomalies where cities should be. The correlation might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. The only way to know is to look. Beneath 2 miles of silence, the tablet sits in Philadelphia. CBS 1063. Climate-controlled vault, archival storage, carefully maintained at stable temperature and humidity to prevent further deterioration. 4,000 years old. Baked clay inscribed with wedge-shaped marks. Signs pressed into soft clay by a scribe who has been dead for longer than recorded history, copied from sources even older, preserving information whose origin the scribe may not have fully understood, but faithfully reproduced, because preservation was the task, accuracy was the virtue, and the knowledge was considered worth maintaining even when its purpose was obscure. The tablet describes cities that existed before a flood. It lists their names. It specifies their locations using measurements that don't correspond to Mesopotamia, but correlate with troubling precision with coordinates in Antarctica, where radar has detected geometric anomalies beneath the ice. This might mean nothing. It might be coincidence, pattern matching, the human mind's tendency to find connections even in noise. It might be symbolic geography misread as literal. It might be a fascinating puzzle that ultimately leads nowhere, a dead end in the search for understanding what the Sumerians meant when they wrote about the world before the deluge. Or it might mean we have been reading messages for thousands of years without understanding they were messages, treating as mythology what was meant as geography, dismissing as impossible what was simply inconvenient to current models. The question remains open. The evidence is ambiguous, but the ambiguity is narrowing. We now have tools. The Sumerians did not. Ice-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, drilling technology capable of reaching bedrock through miles of ice. We have the capacity to test whether the anomalies are natural or structural. We can determine, with physical evidence, whether the correlations are meaningful. Someone will do this, perhaps not immediately, perhaps not intentionally, but Antarctic research continues. Drilling projects multiply, radar surveys refine resolution. Sooner or later, a drill site will coincide with one of the anomalies, and when the core comes up, we will know. If the core shows volcanic rock, sediment, natural geology, we have learned something about Antarctica's geological history, and the Sumerian hypothesis fades back into speculation, interesting but unverified. If the core shows something else, shaped stone, warped surfaces, materials inconsistent with natural formation, then everything changes. Not gradually, immediate. A single confirmed structural element beneath Antarctic ice rewrites the timeline of civilization, confirms that advanced cultures existed earlier and in different locations than current models acknowledge, demonstrates that catastrophic climate events can erase civilizations so thoroughly that only textual fragments remain to hint at what was lost. This is not an abstract possibility. The coordinates exist. The anomalies are documented. The testable prediction is specific. We are closer than any previous generation has been to answering the question definitively. Until that moment, the tablets wait. They have waited for 4,000 years. They can wait longer. But they have never stopped conveying their message, never stopped pointing south, never stopped describing what they insist was there, what might still be there, preserved in frozen darkness, waiting for someone to take the directions seriously enough to follow them to the end. The texts say The Anunnaki established cities at the frozen edge of the world. They say kingship descended from heaven and was established at Eridu. They say the Abzu held storerooms of knowledge, that the divine decrees were kept in archives, that the first settlements existed where ice met the sea. They say the flood came, the waters rose, the old world was lost, and survivors carried what they could to new lands, and began again, copying the old tablets, preserving the old knowledge, never forgetting where they came from, even when they could no longer return. If they were right, if they were recording rather than inventing, then beneath the Antarctic ice, lies the most significant archaeological discovery in human history. Not artifacts from a lost civilization, the civilization itself, intact, frozen at the moment of abandonment. Cities designed by minds as capable as ours, built with organizational sophistication, we recognize because we still use the systems they created: writing, law, measurement, administrative hierarchy. Not aliens, not gods, humans, our predecessors, separated from us, not by capability, but by catastrophe. If the third interpretation is correct, if the texts are maps, then rediscovering these cities means reconnecting with a severed branch of our own story. It means understanding that civilization is older than we thought, more fragile than we assumed, more resilient than we hoped. It means recognizing that everything we consider foundational agriculture, writing, cities, governments, might not be inventions of the societies we credit, but recoveries, restorations of capabilities that existed before and were nearly lost. And it means the Sumerians were not mythologizing, they were remembering. They were maintaining contact through text with ancestors they could no longer reach physically. They were keeping the connection alive, generation after generation, copying tablets whose content seemed increasingly divorced from observable reality, but which they preserved anyway, because the imperative to remember was stronger than the confusion about what was being remembered. This is what makes the tablets sacred, not divine origin, human persistence, the refusal to let knowledge die, even when the context for that knowledge has been destroyed, even when the world the knowledge describes no longer exists. The scribes who copied CBS 1063 in 1600 BCE were working from sources already ancient to them, sources describing a world they had never seen, cities they could not visit, conditions they had never experienced. But they copied faithfully, they maintained accuracy, they preserved the measurements, the coordinates, the specification, they treated the information as essential even when its use was unclear. They were archivists, not theologians. They were maintaining a database, not inventing mythology. And if we have misread them for 4,000 years, treating their records as religious fantasy when they intended documentary preservation, the fault is not theirs. The fault is ours for assuming that because the content seemed impossible, it must be metaphorical. But impossibility is contextual. What seems impossible with current knowledge becomes possible when knowledge expands. The idea that Antarctica was ever habitable seemed impossible before ice core research. The idea that sea levels could rise rapidly seemed impossible before melt pulse documentation. The idea that ancient cultures could preserve accurate geographic information across millennia seemed impossible before Aboriginal Australian oral traditions were verified against bathymetric data. Impossibilities keep becoming possibilities as evidence accumulates. The Sumerian tablets are evidence, not proof. Evidence. They make claims about the past that are testable. They provide coordinates that can be investigated. They describe structures that, if they exist, will be detectable. The claims are falsifiable. This is what distinguishes the hypothesis from unfalsifiable speculation. You can be wrong. You can drill at the coordinates and find nothing. The prediction is specific enough to fail. This is rare in alternative historical theories. Most claims about ancient civilizations are deliberately vague, couched in language that prevents testing, designed to remain unfalsifiable, no matter what evidence emerges. The Sumerian Antarctic hypothesis is different. It provides specific coordinates. It makes checkable predictions. It can be tested and, if wrong, definitively disproven. This is what moves the question from speculation into legitimate scientific investigation. The hypothesis might be wrong, but it is not unfalsifiable, and that makes it worth investigating. What would finding structures mean practically? First, it would mean confirming that the Antarctic Treaty System's prohibition on resource exploitation was prescient in ways its authors didn't intend. The treaty, established in 1959, designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banning military activity, mineral mining, and territorial claims. If ancient cities exist beneath the ice, they would fall under heritage protection laws, making the continent not just a scientific reserve, but an archaeological preserve of unprecedented importance. Access would be restricted, excavation carefully controlled, knowledge shared internationally. Second, it would mean re-evaluating every archaeological site currently considered the earliest or the first. If urban civilization existed during the last glacial maximum or earlier interglacials, then sites like Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, and Çatalhöyük are not origins, but continuations, part of a recovery process rather than initial developments. The timeline of civilization extends backward by thousands of years, and the story of human social complexity becomes longer, more complicated, more interesting. Third, it would mean acknowledging that our knowledge of the past is far more incomplete than academic confidence suggests. If an entire civilization can be missing from historical records simply because it existed in a location that later became archaeologically inaccessible, what else are we missing? What other gaps exist in our understanding? How much of what we consider settled history is actually tentative reconstruction based on survival of evidence rather than comprehensive understanding of what existed? Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it would mean recognizing that civilizational collapse is not permanent. Societies can be destroyed by climate events beyond their control, can lose everything they built, can be forced to flee and start over, and yet knowledge can survive. Skills can be preserved. Rebuilding can occur. The Sumerian example, if the interpretation is correct, demonstrates that catastrophic loss does not mean permanent regression. Survivors carried knowledge forward. They rebuilt. They created a new civilization that was not identical to what came before, but which maintained continuity, which preserved what mattered, which kept the essential knowledge alive until conditions allowed full restoration. This is hopeful. It suggests resilience. It suggests that even after catastrophes that seem civilization ending, recovery is possible if knowledge is preserved. The key is archives, records, writing, the ability to store information outside human memory, to transmit it across generations, to maintain continuity even when physical continuity is broken. The Sumerians understood this. They treated tablets as sacred because tablets were how knowledge survived. They built libraries, maintained scribal schools, copied texts obsessively. They understood that everything they knew depended on preservation, that loss of records meant loss of capability, that maintaining archives was not peripheral to civilization, but foundational. And they understood something else, something we are only beginning to relearn, that the past is not safely distant, that climate changes, that environments transform, that what seems permanent, coastlines, ice sheets, habitable zones, can shift with terrifying speed when conditions destabilize. That civilizations built in one climate regime can be destroyed when that regime ends. That the places we call home might not remain habitable forever. The Sumerian texts, if they document Antarctic refuge cities lost to reglaciation, are warning us. They are saying this has happened before. Civilizations built where conditions seemed stable, then conditions changed, and the cities had to be abandoned. We are the survivors. We rebuilt, but we lost the old cities. We lost the infrastructure, the investments, the accumulated capital of generations. We preserved what knowledge we could, but much was lost. We are telling you this so you know, so you understand that stability is conditional, so you recognize that climate is not static, that the world can transform, that what exists now might not exist in 1,000 years. This is not mythology. This is history. This is what happened, and if it happened once, it can happen again. And so the tablet sits in Philadelphia in its climate-controlled vault, maintaining its 4,000-year vigil. A small clay document with outsized implications, a navigational chart encoded in creation myth, a message sent across time from people who wanted us to know where they came from, where they had been, what they had lost. They left us coordinates. They embedded them in stories durable enough to survive multiple civilizations, adaptable enough to be copied across changing languages and cultures, resilient enough to reach us intact despite every disaster that befell the societies that maintained them. The coordinates point south to ice, to silence, to structures that radar suggests are there, waiting, to a question we now have the technology to answer, but perhaps not yet the courage to ask. Are we alone in history? Are we the first? Or are we the latest iteration, the newest version of a pattern that has repeated before? Building, flourishing, facing catastrophe, preserving what we can, rebuilding elsewhere, carrying forward the knowledge that defines us, even when the places that shaped us are lost. The tablets say, we are not the first. They say there were cities before, in places now inaccessible, built by people whose names we still remember, whose knowledge we still use, whose descendants became us. They say the world has changed before, radically and rapidly. They say civilizations have fallen not through failure, but through forces beyond their control. Climate shifts, ice advancing and retreating, seas rising and falling, the planet itself transforming beneath the fragile settlements humans build and call permanent. And they say knowledge survives. Even when cities are abandoned, when populations are displaced, when whole civilizations are erased from the accessible landscape, the knowledge can be carried forward, written down, preserved, copied, maintained across generations by people who understand that what they know is inherited, not invented, that their capabilities rest on foundations laid by others, that memory matters because without it, everything must be rediscovered from zero. This is the message of the tablets. Not that gods came from the sky, that humans came from the past, that we have been doing this, building civilizations, recording knowledge, preserving what matters for far longer than our current chronologies acknowledge, that our story is deeper, older, more interrupted than we realized, that the continuity we assume is actually reconstruction, recovery from a catastrophic break that nearly severed the chain of transmission but didn't quite succeed because people like the Sumerian scribes refused to let the knowledge die. They copied the tablets, they maintained the archives, they preserved the coordinates, and now, 4,000 years later, we can read what they wrote. We can extract the measurements. We can plot the locations. We can point our radar at the ice and see something there, something geometric, something that might be natural or might be what the tablets say it is. We have reached the point where the question becomes answerable, where speculation transitions to investigation, where hypothesis becomes testable prediction. The only thing left is to actually test it, to take the tools we have developed, drilling technology, remote sensing, ice-penetrating radar, and use them not for the purposes we intended, but for the purpose the Sumerians intended when they encoded these coordinates into text designed to last forever. They wanted us to find them. They wanted us to know we came from somewhere, that we didn't spring into existence fully formed, but emerged from something older, something that fell, but whose knowledge survived the fall. They wanted us to understand that the world changes, that what seems permanent isn't, that civilizations must adapt or perish, that the price of survival is preservation, not of buildings or cities, but of knowledge, of the accumulated understanding that allows rebuilding after catastrophe. And they wanted us to see, if we ever developed the capability, what they left behind. The cities at the frozen edge, the assembly halls where decisions were made, the archives where knowledge was stored, the Abzu, the repository beneath the ice containing whatever records were deemed too important to carry, too essential to risk, sealed in chambers designed to outlast the civilization itself. If those archives exist, if they survive the ice, they contain something more valuable than gold or artifacts. They contain the complete record of an earlier human civilization, written in its own hand, preserved by accident of geography and climate. They contain the knowledge the Sumerians could only partially preserve. Complete technical manuals, full historical accounts, maps of the antediluvian world, records of how that world was organized, what it knew, what it achieved. They contain, in other words, the missing chapters of human history, the part we don't remember because the evidence was buried beneath ice, the part we dismissed as mythology because we couldn't verify it archaeologically, the part the Sumerians tried to preserve in fragments, in copied tablets, in geographic annotations embedded in king lists and creation myths, doing the best they could with the knowledge that survived the catastrophe and the means they had to transmit it forward. If we drill and find those archives, we don't just discover a lost civilization. We recover our own past. We reconnect with ancestors we thought were mythological. We complete the story of where we came from, how long we've been doing this, how many times we've faced disaster and recovered. And we learn whether recovery is always possible, whether knowledge preservation always works, whether the Sumerians succeeded in their goal of transmitting essential information across catastrophe, whether their archives did what they were designed to do: wait out the disaster, survive the centuries of inaccessibility, remain intact until their descendants develop the technology to return and reclaim what was left behind. This is what the tablets are asking us to do. Return, reclaim, remember, complete the loop. They sent the message. We received it. Now we need to respond. We need to follow the coordinates to the end. We need to drill through the ice, reach the bedrock, determine what's there. We need to answer the question the Sumerians posed 4,000 years ago when they wrote down the locations of cities they could no longer visit but refused to forget. The question is simple. Will you remember us? Will you preserve what we preserved? Will you follow the map we left? Will you come find us when you're capable of reaching where we were? And our answer, when we finally drill, will be either yes or no. Yes, we followed the map. Yes, we found you. Yes, you succeeded in preserving the knowledge across impossible spans of time and catastrophe. Yes, we are connected. We are continuous. We are part of the same long story of human persistence and resilience and refusal to forget. Or no, we looked and found nothing. The correlations were coincidence. The texts were mythology. You were inventing, not recording. We are alone in history, the first and only, disconnected from anything that came before, because nothing came before, nothing that left traces, nothing that survived in forms we can recover. Which answer is correct? We don't know yet, but we're close to know it, closer than we've ever been. The tablets have led us to the edge of the ice, to the coordinates they specified, to the moment of decision. All that remains is to drill, and whether we find cities or geology, structures or stone, the question will be answered. The ambiguity will resolve. The mystery that has persisted for 4,000 years. What did the Sumerians mean when they described the Anunnaki cities at the frozen edge of the world? We'll finally have a definitive response. The tablet sits in Philadelphia. The ice sits in Antarctica. The answer sits between them, waiting 2 miles down, beneath the ice, beneath the silence, beneath everything we think we know about who we are and where we come from, waiting for us to stop reading the tablets as mythology and start reading them as maps, waiting for us to follow the directions, waiting for us to come home. If you found yourself questioning as you listened, if the evidence accumulated in ways that made conventional explanations feel inadequate, if you're left wondering whether the tablets might actually be maps, then the investigation has done its work. The question is open. The evidence is available. The testable predictions are clear. What happens next depends not on the tablets, not on the ice, not on what lies buried beneath 2 miles of frozen silence. It depends on whether we take the next step, whether we investigate seriously, whether we're willing to let the evidence lead where it leads rather than where we expected it to go. The Sumerians sent a message across 4,000 years. Whether we choose to respond to it, whether we choose to follow the the coordinates to their conclusion, whether we choose to discover what they were so determined to preserve, that choice is ours. The tablets have done their part. They've waited, they've preserved, they've transmitted the information forward through catastrophe and time and cultural transformation. They've survived long enough to reach us. Now it's our turn. We have the message. We have the coordinates. We have the technology. What we do next writes the final chapter of a story that began before recorded history, that survived the flood, that traveled across millennia in clay tablets copied and recopied by people who believed the knowledge was worth preserving, even when they no longer fully understood what it meant. A story about where we came from, about what we lost, about what we might still find if we look in the right place, if we take the direction seriously, if we accept that sometimes the ancients were not mythologizing but documenting, not inventing but remembering, not creating stories but preserving maps. Maps to cities beneath the eye, maps to our own forgotten past. Maps we've been reading for 4,000 years without realizing we were holding directions home. The ice is 2 miles thick. The silence is absolute. The mystery remains unsolved. But the coordinates are known, and someone, eventually, will follow them. The only question is whether it will be us, in our generation, answering the message the Sumerians sent, or whether we'll pass the tablets forward once again. Let another generation carry the question. Let the mystery persist a while longer, while the evidence accumulates and the technology improves and the moment of discovery draws closer. Either way, the answer waits. Where the tablets say it's been waiting all along.